Peter Molyneux's Twitter parody account, Peter Molyneux, has its own entry on Wikipedia. Did you know that? That fact is utterly amazing to me. In a world of largely faceless people, there's this one man, this one games designer, who's so famous and so well known that the existence of a joke account that spouts ludicrous game ideas in the classic Molyneux style will be preserved forever on the world's most popular information resource. When we're all gone, the aliens will download the whole of Wikipedia and they'll be able to find out about Peter Molyneux themselves. Oh, and Jimmy Wales will still be at the top, in the 26,000th year of his Bitcoin donation drive. To cover Molyneux is an intimidating task. Where do you even start? What do you come up with? And, well, what's your goal? The easy thing to do would be to make something that reflects whatever the popular consensus is on Molyneux at the time, which likely now more than ever wouldn't be very positive. It would be so easy to present all the events and to conclude the video by saying that Molyneux is one of gaming's biggest and greatest chances, to say that Molyneux was once someone great but fell into obscurity and conmanship, or even to say that actually, just how great were Molyneux's best games? Maybe they weren't any good after all. However, I would find that hard to do, seeing as he's the man behind some of my favourite games, who controlled a studio that defined gaming for me, one of the first people in gaming who I was aware of, and admired. So no, I'm not here to scorch Peter Molyneux. I'm here to look at what he's done and be a bit fairer about it, almost to document and appraise his work in as best way as I can in a YouTube video, and also to examine the way he goes about talking to the press, the people that he hires and so forth. And in doing so, perhaps I'll find the answer to some questions. How much of it was passion and how much was bullshit? Just what drove him? And when all's said and done, what is Peter Molyneux's legacy? There's no easy answer to any of those. And yeah, it will take a long time. It's going to be 3 parts, I imagine. As one of the most important figures in the history of British computer games, and indeed computer games as a whole over the last 25 years, he deserves that. And so this is the story of God, or not. Peter Douglas Molyneux, OBE. The story goes that Molyneux first tried to break into games with something called the Entrepreneur in 1984. Caught up in the bedroom coder boom, he was utterly convinced that this text-based business simulator would be a massive hit.
I've cut a bigger post box in front of my front door. I sat by the post box waiting to hear this truck turn up with, tens of thousands of orders.
It wasn't. And according to Peter, he only sold 2 copies of it, one of them being to his mum. It's so obscure that no one seems to know what system it was even made for, although I imagine it was for the C64. Defeated, he left game design forever and settled for a career selling baked beans. No, really. Until one day Commodore gave him a call, mistaking the baked beans company, Taurus, with the company Taurus, with the letter O, that specialised in networking software. The upshot of all of this is that Molyneux stumbled upon the greatest business deal he would ever do. Commodore would provide Taurus and Molyneux 10 free Amigas for porting over the networking software that he didn't do.
There was like an angel and a devil on my shoulders, and one saying, "Go on, you've just got to tell the truth, you can't lie like this." And then this other voice saying, "Just lie, get the machines, go to the stand space and just sort it out afterwards." Of course, I ended up lying.
The understanding was soon cleared up, but Taurus made a database program for the Amiga and, more important than that, they had some computers. An interesting story. I do sometimes wonder about some of the details, particularly anything that involves Commodore giving things away for free, but hey ho. The database and the computers are what allowed Molyneux and his business partner, Les Edgar, to form Bullfrog Productions in 1987, Les handling the admin side and Molyneux the games designer, heading up a handful of people or so in the heart of Guildford, in Surrey. These are the first available games that Molyneux worked on as a designer, a port of a Gauntlet clone called Druid 2, and Fusion, a shoot 'em up of all things. There's nothing wrong with these games, but it has to be said that there are few first games that are more misleading than these ones. To say the least, they were humble, some would even say average, beginnings, but they got Bullfrog's feet on the ground. Molyneux's heart was never at any point with games like these. He envisioned something more ambitious, where you were, well, a god. Populous apparently was first inspired by the work of an artist at Bullfrog, one Glenn Corpse, who was idly building isometric blocks one day, having played David Braben's Virus. Molyneux being Molyneux, one isometric block was enough to set his world afire.
Populous as a game evolved rather than being designed. I think my first thought was, let's create a little world and have these little people moving around this little world.
He developed an isometric landscape, made some little people, or peeps, to potter around it, and watch them play. The game-changing mechanic, being able to raise and lower terrain, was developed simply because doing that would make it easier for the peeps to move around.
Populous was born out of my incompetence as a programmer. This is the absolute truth of it. I thought, why don't I just get the player to flatten the land? So I had them just build a little land and just wander around the shore, and that gave rise to this thing called exploration, and that they could explore. And that was because I wasn't smart enough to do the code.
The next idea was that if the peeps found enough flat terrain, they'd build houses, which would allow them to expand and grow in number. Finally, the game had an aim. There would be another side, also changing the land and expanding their peeps, and the two sides would eventually fight. The side with the most peeps would very likely win.
We play it almost every day, and then that night I'd refine the game in such a way so it would be to my advantage. So I think I won every single game because I used to effectively cheat and refine all the rules.
And so this is how Molyneux created the God game. It should be noted that a God game is a little misunderstood sometimes as a genre. It is not necessarily a sandbox game where you can do anything you want. There are walls and restrictions, and there is a goal to achieve, that of beating the other side. But rather than achieving it through directly controlling the people on the ground, which you never do in Populous, you achieve it through, well, divine intervention, creating the ideal space for the peeps to grow and achieve their goals. The peeps are your followers, and the more they grow, the more money you earn, which you can use for special god powers like creating volcanoes, causing earthquakes, or, most important of all, turning people into knights. There's a balancing act. You can terraform the land to give your peeps space to grow, but you can also meddle with the opponent's land, or build up defences with hills and water. You have much more freedom in something like Civilization than you do in Populous, but Civ is not a god game. The god game in this form is more like a different approach to real-time strategy. So with the concept created, and famously recreated in LEGO to show off to press folks, the team built world after world. The original Populous consisted of 500 levels where two gods could go at it. If you were ever dedicated enough to beat the 500th level, you would be greeted with a single screen text-based ending, because it was only right at the end of the development that the team realised that they'd forgot to code an ending into the game. Populous is such a huge and influential game that I could easily spend another 30 minutes talking about it, but there's no time for that. I don't mean to gloss over it at all by just telling you how the game works, but that's the important bit. These same building blocks cover not just this game, but a lot of other Molyneux games. The game itself was, of course, massive. It was something completely new that received 90% plus scores from every mag going, and a big success for Bullfrog and the game's publisher, Electronic Arts.
And I got this phone call 3 weeks after it was released from one of the chief people at Electronic Arts, and he said, how's it feel to be a millionaire?
And honestly, it deserved all of them. Populous was and is lots of fun. You are, after all, a god who can completely screw up the entire world with a flood, if you please. What's not to love about it? Populous is amazing, and even if you're not in control of the action on the ground as you would normally be, it's no less addictive for that. It's the game that put Bullfrog on the map. It was even ported to consoles, and it is rightly an influential game. It created a whole new genre. Not bad going, to be honest. And it does set out one certain aim for Molyneux that he has with just about all of his games. Molyneux always wants to create something new. In putting Bullfrog on the map, Populous put Peter Molyneux on the map too. Never at any point was Molyneux standing on the sidelines, he was always front and centre. The first in-depth Molyneux print interview might just be here. A big company profile of Bullfrog and their projects in the September 1989 issue of The One. The tone is slightly incredulous, as if Gary Ritter can't believe that this team can produce all the unnamed projects they're being coy about, almost as if Populous was just a fluke. The feature covers 3 games, all of which did come out. Project W was a Peter Molyneux-led project, released in 1990 as Powermonger. Project F was a platformer called Flood. And then there's Project X, for which very little is said, but that would come out too. More on that later. Indeed, the only game covered in depth here that didn't make it was the one that had a name, Glencorp's Creation, which we'll get to soon. The most interesting thing about the feature is seeing the team, and just how young they are, even for a team of coders and graphic designers. One of them, Sean Cooper, wasn't even 20 years old and had come from a YTS scheme. Now he was working on Flood.
It was as if he came in and said, "Give us one of your guys," and then left again. And then I was sent round to his offices, and I had to first of all find his address, which was above a hi-fi shop. And then I rang the buzzer and no one answered. And I rang it again and no one answered still. So I was outside for like 10 minutes, and then someone answered. Hello? I said, "Hello, it's Sean." "Who?" "Sean." And it went silent, and then for 5 minutes no one let me in, so I just thought, oh, perhaps they don't want me anymore.
Molyneux was the ringleader, and for him it almost seemed as if the bedroom coder days never ended. In a later interview he said that he would rather take on young and inexperienced people with good ideas than battle-hardened vets. He even said that he could teach someone to program in 2 weeks, disregarding its importance. However close to the truth that might have been, the team were never short of work. But seriously, how on earth are these young upstarts going to follow Populous? To their credit, they did so with hit upon hit. Here's the next Molyneux game, Powermonger, a relatively early RTS with exciting 3D terrain and a memorable display. The map, complete with massive generals looking at you menacingly, always made the game look fascinating in magazines. It is kind of based on Populous, but being an RTS you have a lot more direct control over your troops. As far as playing it goes, there are probably better RTS games and it is quite hard to understand, but this was certainly something that increased the genre's scope.
I made the fatal mistake of having a good idea, programming that idea up, and actually releasing it without ever really playing it.
Flood, meanwhile, is a different kettle of fish, an odd platformer that's based around the realistic implementation of water in a game, slowly trickling down and flooding the level. As mentioned, Sean Cooper was one of the main people behind this one, and his next game would be an altogether different matter. Both of these games got great reviews and sold well to boot, adding more to Bullfrog's reputation. Just like Populous, Powermonger ended up getting ported to other platforms, including the Mega Drive. Being with the system's top third-party publisher obviously helps with that, mind you. Still, Bullfrog games were already going far beyond the reaches of the Amiga, even at this early stage. Smash cut to the June 1991 second issue of Amiga Power, where the front cover says it all. Even in games magazines it's rare for a designer to find themselves front and centre, but then there hadn't been any designer up to this point who was as welcoming to the press as Molyneux was, and this is one of his greatest early achievements. This 5-page feature is triumphant. Bullfrog, Molyneux and the still tiny team are officially Amiga boys done good and recognised the world over, much like the bitmaps and Sensible. Creation, at this stage, still seemed to be coming along okay, but the real exciting portion is Sean Cooper's game. Bob, or Higher Functions, a game where you, as a head of a corporation, control cyborgs and get them to do your bidding. Can you guess what it is yet? If you want a justification for Molyneux's policy of hiring the young and inexperienced, look no further than Sean Cooper, the then 20-year-old ex-YTS coder who would go on to head up Syndicate, perhaps Bullfrog's greatest game and one of the darkest, most nihilistic, most gripping and flat-out brilliant games ever made. Naturally, we'll be seeing a bit more on that later. Or how about Demi Hasabi, a later hire who would co-design and do the lead programming on Theme Park when he was just 18 years old. He hadn't even finished his computer science degree yet, but Molyneux knew a prodigy when he saw one. So what was it like working there anyway? According to most, it was, in all honesty, a pretty great time. It goes without saying that it was a boys' club where people worked hard and played hard, but they were usually doing so out of passion and love, working on games for long hours because that was what they wanted to do, not because there was a crunch. When you were at Bullfrog, there literally wasn't anything else for you except Bullfrog.
I was next to a fire, an old fireplace, with roosting pigeons that used to crap down the fireplace and splatter up my leg. So at the end of the day, I had bird shit all down my leg. It was really glamorous.
Molyneux himself? Easygoing and approachable as a boss in ways, but determined and with a very powerful skill, an undoubted gift of the gab. If you look over the Amiga Power interview, all the Molyneuxisms are already in place. He almost plays with interviewers, welcoming but coy and always obtuse, but his passion is never questioned. Nobody can sell a game like Peter Molyneux can, and that wasn't just to advertisers, but also to his team. He had such drive and passion towards his products that he always had this certain vision for them, and while that was open to other people, it could cause some other people within his purview to bristle a bit at times. There are some people who tend to dip in and out of the Molyneux empire because of this.
Just go to theme parks, who's going to play this? This is like a kid's game. So I quit. One of my many strops in my time.
He encouraged creativity at Bullfrog and never favoured experience. He made it policy to always stop everything and meet on Friday afternoons, just so everyone could exchange their latest ideas. It's a tough one to pin down. Molyneux might not have been the boss as such, but he was undoubtedly the leader.
He'd have the same shirt on every day, and he'd be hunched over his computer with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, and there'd be cigarette ash all over his computer.
And so finally it was time for the big one at the end of 1991. The sequel to one of the Amiga's most famous games would, more than anything at this point, decide Bullfrog's fate. If Populous 2 were a hit, then it would probably be safe to say that Bullfrog were the biggest and best thing going on the whole of the Amiga. To show once and for all that there was nothing fluky about them by making a great follow-up to their premier title. I've waited until the sequel to go a bit more in depth about Populous, because while the original was so good and so groundbreaking, Populous 2 Trials of the Olympian Gods feels like the true finished version. Seriously, what a sequel. You have a consistent ancient Greek theme, and the ability to customise your deity and increase his skills. You have an instantly usable and streamlined interface. It's not the book from the original, but it moves so smoothly. There's new handy options like Armageddon, which allows you to drop everything and just go straight to an all-out battle to the death, as well as new heroes with more abilities than the original game's knights. Everything great about the first game is here, but better in every way, and it's one of the best sequels ever made. There is an argument to be made that Molyneux, as a games designer, never got higher than Populous, that he started at the top and has been working his way down ever since. It's rare for someone to create something so new, yet so intuitive and, well, just so all-out fun and addictive and filled to the brim with personality. Populous 2 is just as it was in 1991, an absolutely essential game that must be played and one of the Amiga's greatest games. In the end, Populous 2 was a triumph, more 90% scores, not a single score below that from any Amiga magazine in fact. It's a classic victory lap sequel. The game just needed to be a triumph, and with that it was clear that Bullfrog had already won. And this is before we get to Syndicate and Theme Park. This is before we even see a bunch of the stuff that ended up never being released. Bullfrog Productions were at this stage on a truly amazing run, and it would only get better. After all, it wasn't just Molyneux. One of the most important things to note about the man is just how much talent, in a way, he ended up nurturing. And a look at Bullfrog would be incomplete without properly seeing the two games that came from the studio's most apt pupils. First up, Sean Cooper. He joined Bullfrog on a YTS, or Youth Training Scheme, which, if you don't know, was basically a training course for school leavers back in the late 80s, early 90s. Or alternately, a way for employers to get someone to make the tea for less than peanuts. Famously, the doomed character in the classic Specky Joke game Advanced Lawnmower Simulator is a YTS junior gardener. And that was most folks on YTS, only without the death.
I was helping out a lot of people, and we started building games and different pieces of software, and just basically mucking about trying to learn stuff. And that's when Peter Molyneux came in.
Anyway, I digress. Sean Cooper joined Bullfrog, and now he was about to make one of the greatest games ever made. Syndicate evolved from being people screwing about with AI and thinking of ways that they could batter each other, into a futuristic cyberpunk world domination simulator and strategic shooter, where teams of agents do horrible things to cities. Brutal assassinations, mind control, sprawling gunfights where innocents get caught in the crossfire. Syndicate is not a nice game. It's one of the creepiest and most atmospheric games ever made. In 1993 you almost never saw a living, breathing city in games, let alone something like this in the Blade Runner and Neuromancer mould. Every mission is immaculately designed and brings a new challenge to the table as your agents get stronger and stronger. There's so many ways to complete objectives, and some of them are just so on. This isn't merry Grand Theft Auto mayhem, this is Harry Limes scoffing at any compassion you might feel for those dots down there. It's scary, and the best way I can convey this is to, without comment, show you the story of Special Agent Bush. I feel it's necessary to point out that the actions in this story are not something that I condone in any way. This is merely a demonstration of one possibility that the game Syndicate offers, of many. I should also note that this section comes with a content warning, and if you want to skip it, then please click that annotation below. Thank you. Yes, that is something you can do in Syndicate, with your own mind. I could talk about this game for hours, many hours. One day I probably will. For now I'll have to move on and just say that it is, quite simply, Bullfrog's greatest achievement. A game unlike any other, and one that I approach with, I must say, a certain alarm. Demi Hasabi, the other man in question here, was, as I mentioned, a prodigy. By the time he was 13 he was already a chess master. Demi was hired by Bullfrog when he was a mere 16 years old and started off by designing levels on Syndicate, before lead programming and co-designing Theme Park the very next year with Molyneux.
And the idea of the game was that you designed your own Disney world, And thousands of little people with their own desires and characteristics came into that Disney World and judged and decided how much fun they had in your theme park. And then if they would go and tell their friends, and they would come the next day.
I've already done a review on Theme Park on this channel, but I'll sum up my thoughts briefly. The brilliance of the original theme park doesn't merely lie in the wonder of building your very own land where kids have a magical day out, it lied in combining that with fleecing those kids for every single penny they had, all the joys of ruthless capitalism. Theme Park was Bullfrog's most hardcore simulator to date, a game that revelled in tiny details and signature Molyneux touches, like it being a genius move to, say, put up a chip stand, jack up the salt content, and then stick a cola stand next to it, watered down with ice cubes, obviously. And if you sell strong coffee, then your customers will move around the park like greased lightning. Theme Park is one of the most penny-pinching games ever. You build a glorious roller coaster, and at the same time you water down the beer and make it virtually impossible to win on the coconut shy, all the while paying your staff peanuts. It's almost comic that the best way to earn money in Theme Park is by being an asshole boss. It really is. You almost don't realise that you're doing it. These two games were, of course, huge hits. Two of the most famous games ever to come out for the Amiga, in fact. You don't really need me to tell you what the general opinion on Peter Molyneux was back then. He was revered, a sun god. For some people he might have been the best games designer in the world at the time, and the rest of his studio could match him. Bullfrog were right up at the top of the tree. And really you can't argue with his track record. By 1994 Molyneux himself had been heavily involved with 3 all-time classic games, and virtually everything that Bullfrog had made since Populous was golden. I posed the fake question earlier on, the one supposing that maybe Molyneux's best stuff was never truly great, the one posed by people who'd wonder how on earth Molyneux ever got such status. For the answer you just need to look at the legacy of his first company. Even without the games, the creative freedom and ideas that Molyneux inspired at Bullfrog would be something special. But who boy did they have the games. Every single game that they released on the Amiga, after Populous, would end up being acclaimed as amongst the best to come out on the machine. But perhaps one more loose end needs to be tied up. Remember Project X? It didn't end with that first interview. In the aforementioned issue of Amiga Power, there was a competition to actually win a job at Bullfrog, and not just making the teas or testing the games, as a fully fledged programmer who would work on the top secret Project X. The task was to code a unique variation on Space Invaders. It would take a while, but the results would finally be announced in the August 1992 issue. The winner was Mr. Wobbly Leg versus the Invaders from Space, and the coder was a certain Mr. Mike Diskett, who would go on to head up Syndicate Wars.
I made Syndicate Wars 15 years ago, back when I had a full head of hair.
He also did the original programming on Project X. So what do you think this project was, having put everything together? Well done if you guessed Theme Park. It was a pet project of Molyneux's for quite a while. Diskett, along with the man himself and Hasabi, was instrumental in finally bringing it to being, doing a lot of the coding on the game. And it all started with a competition in Amiga Power. And so that's the legacy of Bullfrog Productions, arguably the most exciting and flat-out greatest team of coders in the history of the Amiga. Certainly the youngest. A truly glorious time that some would argue was the pinnacle of Peter Molyneux's career. Next we see how the glory days of Bullfrog came to an end. Theme Park would be Bullfrog's final Amiga game. They were one of many who decided to, at last, leave the system behind. They would hit the ground running on the PC with 1994's Magic Carpet. Led by Mark Huntley and Sean Cooper, one of the first third-person 3D games out there, brought into existence through lots of lovely voxel. It's an odd game. You'd think it hasn't held up because it's a 3D game from 1994, but in a way it has, because I can't think of much else like it. It's a very open-ended game where you, a wizard, try to collect mana while protecting balloons that collect mana from dead enemies and other sources. Collecting mana builds the castle, and once the castle is built, you've completed the world. Simple. Once you figure it out anyways. It does work well as a just screw around and shoot things game, especially because this 3D game from 1994 actually has destructible terrain. And after enough blasting with enough patience, you'll figure it out. I also really like this old Games Master segment where Dave Games Animal Perry, presumably reading from a Molyneux script, proposes a far-out idea that combines Magic Carpet with that old chestnut, Creation. Still hyped 5 years on.
Like a flight sim carpet, and you're shooting all these monsters that are coming at you from the sea and everything, and all of a sudden you're getting bored, you've been playing it for a couple of hours, and so just by dipping the carpet towards the sea, you suddenly enter a completely different game called Creation, which is set under the sea. And as long as that game is stored on your hard drive, there's no need to reload the game or anything. The computer instantly recognises the instruction and puts you straight into the new game.
It's not my favourite Bullfrog game, but Magic Carpet's certainly fun enough, and yes, it was another huge hit. It's one of the games that people most readily associate with Bullfrog, in fact. Whether it was 2D or 3D, the company was going from strength to strength. Behind the scenes, however, there were lots of things that were changing. There is such a thing called the Molyneux cycle, coined by Jim Sterling as a shorthand for the extravagant promises that tend to be made during the hype period for one of his studio's games, which are then frequently not met. We'll get into that later, but I would like to introduce a second Molyneux cycle to describe his time with various companies. And it all started with Bullfrog and their main publisher, Electronic Arts. Molyneux's gift of the gab allowed him to become very close with other companies while still at the head of his own flagship. Bullfrog weren't just a company that published games for EA, they were essential to their vision going forward. And Molyneux himself was just as essential to that vision.
One day, the phone started to ring, and there were all these big companies saying, look, if you ever want to sell your company, we're really interested in buying it. We're going to take you out to dinner, or we're going to fly you to this resort. And it was like being a rock star.
And so the relationship between EA and Bullfrog would get ever closer. In 1992, EA bought a significant amount of shares in the company. At the start of 1995, this led to EA acquiring Bullfrog all out. However, unlike many other EA software house acquisitions, Molyneux remained as the company's head. More than that, Molyneux was now a vice president at EA, giving him who knows how many other hats and responsibilities, and that meant that he would also consult and help out with other companies and divisions under the EA umbrella. But still, the main one for him was overseeing Bullfrog.
It was a vast sum of money. This group of people were getting a little bit impatient. You know, there was nowhere for them, lots of them to grow. Selling out to Electronic Arts, who were really passionate about the games that we made, just seemed like the right thing to do.
So what happens next? Well, even if the culture around the office might change a little thanks to big overarching companies with their marketing and their HR and what have you, business at Bullfrog for the next couple of years appears to be as good as ever. More arcade-based games such as the sequel to Magic Carpet and the popular sci-fi racer High Octane are released in 1995. There is another strategy game that's perhaps not as famous as a lot of other Bullfrogs called Gene Wars, which isn't as well received as some of the other games but does have its fans. The aforementioned Syndicate Wars arrives in 1996, the sequel to perhaps Bullfrog's greatest game, at least in my opinion. That's something of a tall order, especially seeing as the game is 3D to boot, but the result is certainly worthy of the name, complete with a level of destruction that honestly hadn't been seen in any game up to that point. It's not as good as the original, the 3D graphics haven't aged well, and it'll never be as scary a game again, but Syndicate Wars is still another really fun strategic, blow everything up and destroy all cities shooter. It's pretty damn fantastic. And in the midst of all this, Molyneux finds time to head up another game, 1997's Dungeon Keeper, a game with a simple enough concept. What if you were in charge of all of those dungeons that the hero has to beat? Haven't you ever thought that you could do a better job of designing them and keeping heroes at bay? It sounds great, and it largely is. A new and altogether fiendish take on simulation, where you can slap your workers into shape and imprison enemies at your leisure. It It is kind of dank, but easy enough to understand and play. It's a lot easier to control lists than it is Syndicate Wars, has to be said. Molyneux's design was still very strong despite all his new responsibilities. However, Dungeon Keeper was delayed and Molly had to fund a significant amount of the development out of his own pocket in order to keep EA from killing it.
We were locked up in his house for a period of time, but we had great fun because we'd play each other in the night. Okay, Peter say, it's a design flaw when he lost, and changed the game so it was altered around.
Still, the game was released to another big round of applause and plenty of sales to boot. It did absolutely brilliantly. And lastly in this little roundup, we have another absolute barnstormer, Theme Hospital from March 1997. It's like Theme Park, only this time set in a hospital, which doesn't necessarily appeal to some of Bullfrog's vets.
All Peter said was it's called Theme Hospital, so I thought, great, it's even worse than the game I left in the first place.
Ah well, never mind Gary. Theme Hospital is fantastic. There's a big satirical bent, an almost absurd carry-on Doctor-a-thon mood to the whole thing where you are in charge of healing the sick, and usually failing. But with this game, it was clear that Bullfrog's themes, where you build a world and those little people fill it with their own desires, that could work anywhere. It didn't just have to be in an amusement park, it could be in something as mundane as a hospital.
This was, and is, by far the most successful game that Bullfrog ever made. I think it's sold some ridiculous number, I think it's about 9 million copies on the PC alone, so I'm quite proud of this one. This is one big tick of the games that I'm really pleased I worked on.
Theme Hospital improved on the formula in every way, and it's right up there with the original, Syndicate and Populous 2, one of the studio's very best games. And alas, their last game that would come close to reaching that sort of level. It is usually around this time, a couple of years down the road, that the Molyneux cycle enters its second half. Quite simply, well, Peter Molyneux tends to get a bit bored. He feels as though he's not really in charge anymore. He yearns to get back to the way things once were. Smaller but more creative teams with people he can supervise and talents he can nurture. He himself wants to get his head fully back into game design, as he tires of his more executive and onerous duties as vice president of wherever. And so, even though things are at this point going very well indeed, in August of 1997, to the shock of just about everyone, Peter Molyneux leaves EA, and with it he leaves Bullfrog, the company that he created, with a heavy heart. Various Bullfrog alumni will eventually ride with him again, but suddenly Bullfrog is without its leader.
I went to the president of Electronic Arts and I said, look, this is my problem. I'm not doing the job I love. I can either go back to being a designer, which was taking this huge step backwards, or I could leave, set up another company, and publish my games through Electronic Arts. And that is exactly what I did.
Does any of this sound familiar so far? It is the same scenario that would play out many years later with Lionhead, although with the odd difference in circumstance. It's certainly a tough situation for Bullfrog because while there are so many brilliant and creative people working at Bullfrog, for many Bullfrog was Peter Molyneux. He's not the only one to leave Bullfrog around this time. Mike Diskett, creator of Syndicate Wars and winner of that Amiga Power competition, leaves alongside Gary Carr and a bunch of others to form Muckyfoot Productions, the creators of Startopia. An exodus continues over the next couple of years. Glenn Corpse forms Lost Toys in 1999, Simon and Dean Carter form Big Blue Box, and that won't be the last time you'll hear that name, and there would be plenty more. All of the companies, including Molyneux's new one, would stay in Guildford, which had the side effect of making Guildford one of the UK's top places for video game development. And of course other Bullfrog alumni, such as programmer Mark Webley, leave to join Molyneux on his new adventure, many miles away. Okay, just down the road in Pete's mansion, for that is where his new company, Lionhead Studios, would be born. Molyneux could also count on the return, in at least for a short time, of prodigal AI genius Demi Hasabi. Company co-founder Les Edgar, now also an executive at EA, would stay on, and if anyone was to be Molyneux's creative replacement, it would be Sean Cooper. Having actually left Bullfrog in 1996 after a dispute with Molyneux, Cooper took his departure as an opportunity to return. Bullfrog's later years are a mixed bag. At first, things still appeared okay. Projects that were started under Molyneux were finished, and other games still appear to be good, or at least successful. There's a new Populous called Populous the Beginning that can actually still be played online to this very day thanks to the fans, but didn't go down as well with fans of the original, and Dungeon Keeper 2, complete with its, very 1999 indeed box art, but still a good game with Cooper at the helm instead of Molyneux. However, the big warning sign was 1999's Theme Park World, mainly because it was not satirical at all, it was in fact quite casual, and frankly it wasn't very good. Certainly not when compared to the infinitely better Roller Coaster Tycoon. It's this one title that's not very good that makes you see a bigger problem. Suddenly all that Bullfrog are producing are direct sequels to their older products. While Dungeon Keeper 2 was a very good sequel indeed, Populous the Beginning was, well, it's okay, and Theme Park World, well, compared to the original and Theme Hospital, not only was it rubbish, it was also one thing that Bullfrog games hadn't been. It was boring and generic. And so this is the final part of the Molyneux company cycle. What happens to the company in question after his departure? Molyneux's other hidden strength as a boss becomes clear. He is very skilled at keeping his flagship company away from all the shitty stuff that comes from being under a bigger company's empire, usually thanks to his high standing in said empire. With Molyneux gone, Bullfrog are suddenly no longer immune from executive meddling. And what do you know? Suddenly you're making endless sequels to Theme Park and original projects just don't happen anymore. Creation, a project that was originally named all the way back in that 1989 interview in Le One, is one of the most notable casualties. The idea itself, featuring a world that's mostly underwater and a caretaker in charge of a tiny aquatic population that needs to survive and thrive, was great and hyped up quite a lot. It even had a trailer released in 1995, but in the end, despite everything, it was cancelled in 1997 in the most pragmatic fashion. 4 words: sub-games don't sell. The Indestructibles was another major project that bit the dust, this time in 1996. You control a superhero in a 1900s world that almost sounds like a sandbox where you can chuck cars around, deform the landscape and battle enemies. It sounds like Crackdown on the Xbox 360 only 5 years before the release of Grand Theft Auto 3. Alas, it never made it. Various other projects didn't make it, including more theme games that weren't based around amusement parks, and mysterious titles like Voidstar and Genesis: The Hand of God. Alas, Theme Park World and Theme Park Inc., they all did make it. Fortunately, Bullfrog's end wasn't all that drawn out. In 2001, EA decided to fold the company into EA UK, finishing off Bullfrog Productions. Les Edgar was already gone by this point, out of EA and eventually out of the industry. He's now the chairman of resurrected UK sports car manufacturers TVR. Sean Cooper left the picture but stayed in the EA fold, working heavily on James Bond 007 Everything and Nothing and, oh jeez, the Godfather game. It must be said that the limitless psychopathic loan shark potential of this game makes a lot more sense when you consider that the man behind Syndicate was heavily involved. Anyway, he would move on to the casual market after EA, and he stayed there until recently. Occasionally EA made noise about the UK studio resurrecting old Bullfrog titles, but for the most part this basically never happened, and the studio were most famous for Harry Potter tie-ins before being closed completely in 2011, by which time they were known as EA Bright Light. No matter, Bullfrog's story had ended 10 years previously, and despite the shaky end, they are still one of the greatest companies ever to grace gaming as a whole, let alone just from the UK, with a ratio of classic and just flat-out unique games that very few studios can match. They already had this reputation in 1997 when Peter Molyneux left, and with his next company, people were wondering if he could do the same thing over again. So here we are, the second part of the journey. We've just seen Peter Molyneux leave Bullfrog to set up another studio in Guildford, Lionhead. His reputation is still akin to a sun god. He'd led one of gaming's greatest studios, responsible for classic after classic. The story of Bullfrog encompasses not just Molyneux, but a whole generation of great British coders who got started there. The man is by this point already a legendary figure. Only a couple of game designers could ever have claimed to surpass the reputation that Peter Molyneux had back in 1997. We didn't know what Lionhead was going to do, but we were pretty sure it was going to be great. And so this is the first part of their story, the attempt to create a new, truly independent studio even as gaming itself got bigger and bigger. We'll go up all the way to the creation of a monster that ended up swallowing it whole. But for now it's time to, once again, play God. In many ways, the formation of Lionhead Studios was Peter Molyneux starting from scratch. He'd tired of the situation at Bullfrog, and now it was time to re-roll.
This time, all the problems that we've had in the past we can get right. We have got to create some great original ideas, some ideas that have never been attempted or created before.
He'd do so with the aim to avoid what he'd had near the end of his time there. He didn't want to employ lots of people, and he wanted to be free of control from any big publisher so that he could focus entirely on game design. Essentially just as Bullfrog were in the days before they were bought by Electronic Arts. He stated his two cardinal rules many times, including here in a 1997 interview with Simon Carlos. Lionhead will only work on one title at a time, and they would never employ more than 20 people. Molyneux wanted a small team comprised of what he naturally dubbed the best of the best of the best, whether it was people he'd previously worked with at Bullfrog, or the scant few who were recruited through adverts in the likes of Edge magazine.
Peter founded Lionhead with the intention of keeping that family atmosphere, keeping teams together and passionate about their projects, not big company politics and being part of the machine.
It was a test. In a time when studios were vastly expanding to meet the increased requirements of the generation's standards, was there still space for a small studio? Peter Molyneux would break both of those rules eventually, but we'll see how long he lasted.
We originally wanted to call Lionhead Red Eye. It turned out that Red Eye, just about every company in the world is called Red Eye, and we couldn't call it Red Eye, so we panicked. Mark Webley, my business partner, says, hey, why don't we call it after my hamster? He's called Lionhead. Mark then went to go and check on the hamster, who turned out to be dead, in his cage stiff with rigor mortis, so we are named after a dead hamster.
The other main reason for Lionhead was so that Molyneux could create, well, his next grand vision, something groundbreaking that would take a very long time and would not have been possible at Bullfrog. It's thought that by the time of this interview, he and Demi Hasabi were around a year into creating what would eventually be Black and White. The game isn't even called that yet, but Molyneux simply says that the new project is simply far beyond anything that they've attempted before and doesn't even tie his mast to a rough release date. It would soon be too big for the cellar of his mansion. Lionhead quickly moved into new offices in Guildford, at 1 Ockham Court, a decently sized space with essentially a decent pub close by. The boys' club atmosphere reigned once again, with the staff working from morning till midnight on the game, fueled by endless cigarettes and Chinese takeaways. The familiar rules were still in place: stop everything on Friday afternoon for a creative meeting, and test, test, test. As soon as a working prototype was playable, Molyneux felt it imperative to test as much as possible, not just to spot bugs and problems, but to see where the game could go next. The Molyneux philosophy then is just as it was with Populous. A game isn't planned meticulously from the outset so much as it is evolved into being, usually through lots of testing and brainstorming. Again, people who worked at Lionhead attest that this wasn't due to Molyneux having a whip hand. He didn't have one. He didn't even specify hours for employees. Seemingly you just went there, and that was where you were for however long. Molyneux inspired creativity, and he inspired dedication. The early days of Lionhead were just as fertile as the glory days of Bullfrog, only now all of the energy was focused on one title that was, apparently, monumental. Scheduling was not a thing. The game would be done when it was done, but it had to be done. In the later days of development, there was a period where the team spent 9 months working 15 hours a day in the studio in typical crunch fashion. Even though some folks bowed out, such as Demi Hasabi in 1998, the 25-strong studio was filled with people who had become amongst the best and brightest in British gaming, just as Bullfrog was. I mean, as damaging as it could have been to lose a literal genius who knows more about AI than just about anyone in the world, the other man who was actually hired thanks to that Amiga Power competition in 1992 as a runner-up, and would later go on to sell his company DeepMind to Google for $500 million, Lionhead was strong enough to weather that particular blow.
Even can predict ahead of time. It's modelled the world, the game world so well, it knows where the Space Invaders will be ahead of time. So as the Space Invaders speed up, when you get less of them on the screen, it fires the final shot as a kind of predictive shot of where the final Space Invader will be in a few seconds' time.
The new team was stocked full of talent. There were names like Mark Webley, Mark Healy and John T. Barnes who had been with Molyneux since the Bullfrog days, as had Andy Robson, who headed up the all-important testing department and had the power to say to Molyneux that this idea was unworkable, or sod this other idea, there's bugs that need fixing. And he did so, often. Paul McLaughlin and Russell Shaw, heading up art design and music respectively, had been with Molyneux virtually since the start. Newer hires, such as Karima Tooney, would go on to achieve greatness later on, having started out with Lionhead. It was a team that could undoubtedly match the quality of Bullfrog's, if not surpass it, which is one of the reasons why Lionhead never achieving their full potential was such a great shame. But of course we have to get into that later, much later. One thing is for sure, in the utterly convoluted and incestuous world of the British games industry, you can find a quite ridiculous amount of people connected to Molyneux, or who got their start from Molyneux. Anyway, back to Black and White. Every so often the hype for the game would rise as Molyneux came back to the press, a surefire way to earn column inches and TV time. Here's Lionhead in December 1999 with Molyneux showing off early bits of the gameplay.
Here there is a barrel, and on that barrel is a little apple, and in that apple you can just see there is a worm, and I can go from looking at this worm and pull back and actually look at the whole village, obviously, and even go further back and look at the whole world.
Here's Molly again on the final ever episode of Bits, talking up the game with Emily Newton-Dunn and saying some quite questionable things.
There's lots of special things you can do with a creature. First of all, on his first birthday, he will have this overwhelming urge to create his own web page. Another thing you can do that's great with the creature is tattoo him.
It is probably around here, now that Molyneux is on camera more and more, where we really see Molyneux's media personality come to the fore. But we'll go through that soon enough. For now, Molyneux was content with usually saying relatively modest things. For the most part, at least at this moment, features that Molyneux talk about end up in the finished game, although it is obviously going to be utterly groundbreaking.
Me as a games designer didn't say, right, you will be evil, or you will be good, or you have to do this, or you have to do that to actually progress through the game. You be yourself. Then this fascinating thing could happen, is the game would actually perhaps turn into something like a personality test. So there was lots of sort of complicated ideas bubbling under my head, as there normally is, I suppose.
Meanwhile, the work continued furiously as EA, the game's publisher, constantly asked questions about the game's development that could be summed up as simply, when the hell is this coming out? As the cycle got longer and longer, and the game got more and more out there. And naturally expensive. Not that Lionhead tended to believe all that much in deadlines. The hype was probably right on the brink of being too much, and too long at this point. Black and White was going to be the greatest PC game ever, but when were we actually going to see it? And, geez, what about the ports? They were supposed to be a thing that came out for people to buy, and something to really show that the consoles could handle a god game of this magnitude. This is the trailer for the PS1 version, and here's another trailer for the Dreamcast version. Neither version is available, but both were apparently quite close to completion around the time that the hammer fell on them. However, these ports never arrived. In particular, the Dreamcast being discontinued in April of 2001 was a fatal blow to the port's developers, Chrysalis Software, who also happened to be Amiga veterans by the way. Finally, and most brutally, EA were not interested in hiring the development team and saving the games. And indeed the studio. The cancellation of the black and white ports killed Chrysalis and they folded in November of 2001. Just one minor casualty of this whole production cycle. Finally though, after all the drama of building a new 30-person studio, the arrivals and departures, the genesis, all of that coding, the endless testing and a shipping container's worth of chicken chow mein, at the start of 2001, Black and White arrived, one of the most hyped PC games ever. But before the reaction, let's see what it's like to actually play Black and White in 2016. Oh, wait, no. There's something else I need to digress into quickly.
Well, if it isn't Tamagotchi, her new favorite pet.
Yes!
So what's that make me, fish sticks?
Oh, are you hungry?
Oh, no. By all means, feed it. Play till your heart's content.
Tamagotchis. The spawn of two people, Akihiro Yokoi and Aki Maita. Originally sold by Bandai in late 1996, and it didn't take long for them to become massive worldwide with millions upon millions sold. They were virtual pets that you could play with via a little LCD screen, and you could wear the Tamagotchi around your neck. You could feed it, nurture it, all sorts. You could create your own little virtual pet family. The Tamagotchi craze hit over here in 1997, and basically everybody had one. Well, every girl anyway. The Tamagotchi was marketed as quite a feminine toy over here. The more masculine and extreme version was also sold in 1997, the original Digimon. The toys could be controversial as half a day of not caring for the pet could be disastrous and result in their death, meaning that kids took their Tamagotchis to school. You know how annoying 30-year-old farts who you went to school with on Facebook always post silly pictures about how they weren't distracted by their mobile phones in class? Yeah, right. They had Tamagotchis to distract them instead. Anyway, you'll never guess who else had a Tamagotchi. Yep. Peter Molyneux loved his Tamagotchi, fed his Tamagotchi, cared for his Tamagotchi, talked about his Tamagotchi to everyone, including Andy Robson, who frankly didn't see the appeal of the thing. One day, when Molyneux was out of the office, Robson took Peter Molyneux's Tamagotchi and dropped it into a mug of hot tea. Upon his return, Molyneux was horrified to find the scene of the crime, the murder of his beloved Tamagotchi. According to some, he mourned. And perhaps it was this moment, this realisation of just what feelings you could have for an entirely virtual pet, that set Molly's world afire even more than those isometric blocks that had triggered Populous. This virtual pet ended up truly defining just what sort of a game Black and White was going to be. Black and White is indeed the sort of god game where you can do anything and be anything. In many ways it's the classic video game fake morality where apparently choosing whether or not you want to throw a villager directly into the sun with that big old hand for no reason is a deep moral decision worthy of a 9.5 from GameSpot. And yet there is also a sort of real morality in how you treat the pull of the game, the virtual creature. The creature is supposed to be a representation of you on Earth, and you can train it to do anything. It can eat grass, animals, and yes, people. That's also more sandbox shenanigans, but the morality comes in what you do next. Stroke the creature, or slap it. You get to tell the creature if what it did was good or bad. There's very few games where you are so utterly in control of the rules as you are in Black and White, where your actions can have such an effect on a creature's personality. The way that you treat your creature and your people affect the very nature of your world, and both approaches have advantages. You have to make people believe, and you can do that through performing miracles and saving their lives, or aiming a few boulders at their houses. That creature, as they grow bigger in size, becomes the main defender of your land, and they can fight others. The world itself will appear different depending on just what you do. It's all quite muddy as there's no right way to achieve your goal as a god. It becomes an almost impulsive and barely thought through decision, reacting to things as they happen. Black and White is kind of an odd title, to be honest. It doesn't actually fit with just how grey the game can be. A creature picks up a person, toys around with it a bit, and you give it a stroke for just being so nice. Then after you've done that, the creature eats the person to the horror of everyone. On one level this will never stop being really frickin' funny, but it sticks with you as you actually ponder why that happened. Maybe the creature wasn't being malicious. Maybe they were just hungry. My creature also ended up eating a beach ball at one point, so maybe I've just built them up to eat everything. Perhaps I should think about changing their diet lest they grow too fat. But is it good, I hear you cry, after all this time yammering on about Tamagotchis and what have you? Yes, it is. It's amazing. Those 5 years were worth it. And it's still amazing because no game has come close to doing what it did before or since. For all the freedom you have, the decision to be a good god and treasure the people, or to rule them with an iron fist, the true freedom is in just watching and letting things happen. Watching as your creature roams free, doing things that make you laugh or even outright shock you. It's still so different, such a wonderfully impulsive experience. And yes, you should still play it now. For me, this game is an essential document. In later years, morality and behaviour and all those things were streamlined with slider bars. How easy, how binary, how boring. Black and White is a dilapidated signpost signalling the hard road not taken. It's not wholly perfect as a game. Some would even say that there isn't even all that much game in here. But for some, just the experience can be unforgettable. Even now. It's the perfect Tamagotchi. The original reception for Black and White was, well, pretty damn great. Huge scores everywhere, big reviews saying that after almost 5 years in development, Lionhead had actually broken new ground. Molyneux was again at the height of his powers. He'd done it again, he'd changed the whole scenery. Weirdly though, that critical love, it didn't last. The backlash against Black and White seemed to start a couple of years later, when GameSpy of all websites put it at the top of a most overrated games list, saying that despite all the creature training, the learning, the freedom, the actual proper frickin' world, where's the game, dude? It's smoke and mirrors, innit? Now 9.9 times out of 10 people don't listen to GameSpy, but oddly enough this seemed to stick and the game's reputation just slid from there. I'm not sure if it's harsh or not to say that Black and White is the be here now of Molyneux's career, but for such a praised and big selling game it's almost forgotten now. It's an odd middle child between his last projects at Bullfrog, your dungeon keepers and the like, and the monster that was to come next and sweep everything away. A sequel, arriving in 2005, was received okay but much more coolly than the original game was, and sales were disappointing. Of course, by that point Lionhead's mind was on some other game entirely, the game that would dominate everything. But before we get to the monster, I feel that it's only fair to give Lionhead's other original game the time it deserves, because otherwise it's just not going to happen. In 2005, Lionhead released the movies. Adrian Moore headed up the project, a guy who'd gradually worked his way up the Bullfrog ladder before leaving in the late 90s to help start up Small Rockets, another Guildford studio that spun off from the company following Molyneux's departure. Some of those studios didn't make it too far. With Small Rockets gone, along with the likes of Mucky Foot, people like Moore and Gary Carr of Theme Hospital fame found themselves hooking up with Molyneux once again at Lionhead, where they would be welcomed with open arms.
So I went back to Peter again. It's like my sugar daddy.
Carr would find himself on a quite mysterious project that we can't really go into yet, but Moore would do the movies, a business simulation game. Two words that almost automatically make the game seem like a welcome throwback to the Bullfrog days and games like Theme Park.
You get to build a movie studio. Sounds okay.
You've been working on this game for quite a long time. How long actually has it been in the making?
I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning on January the 19th, 2002, next to my girlfriend, and I said, I've had this brilliant idea for a game, and she said, go back to sleep, you crazy idiot.
The premise itself is quite fun. You can be a proper movie mogul. You set up a studio in 1920, hire stars, get scripts written, shoot the films and release them in all their glory, trying to make your studio the best as the eras go by and movies continue to evolve. You react to reviews, hire new stars, manage those stars and make sure they don't claw each other's eyes out, all sorts. It sounds fantastic, but sadly the movies doesn't really do it for me in the way that Bullfrog Sims did. It just lacks something. It never helps when there's an awful and really long tutorial section to kick everything off, of course, but it's the sort of game where it feels like you've seen most of it right out of the gates, like an hour or so in. Make a movie, and repeat. The more movies you make, the better they'll be, and the better your stars will be. It's all about increasing in size. You just don't feel as involved with the process as you did in Theme Hospital and the like. It's almost as if you're a god, not a mogul, funnily enough. The people on the ground are amusing to watch with all their movements and the like and all of their personalities and quirks, but it does all feel a little bit like a fancy take on The Sims, only with a lot of stuff attached that doesn't really fit, meaning of course that it's not as streamlined or as flat out good as The Sims. So yeah, the game starts off quite badly, but a couple of hours in, it turns out it actually does work. You get into a definite rhythm of always doing something. Just as you get in another film ready to shoot, someone's going to be writing the script for the next one. Improvements to the studio come thick and fast. Actors are throwing tantrums, so you have to try and de-stress them. The unbearably slow and hand-holdy start of the game ends up revealing something quite fast-paced and fun, with definite progression. It's an absolute no-brainer that your first movies will tank horribly, but it gives you time to experiment and get a feel for the whole thing. In the end, it's good. I still don't think it's a patch on either of the proper theme games, but it has its merits. Even if 1920s cinema audiences might not be quite ready for something like War Men, I can damn well give it to them anyways. Mind you, the Sims side is only one part of the movies. The other part is in actually being able to create your own scenes and the like, which is the way you can actually make these movies feel as if they're your own. This could have been the real pull of the game, and Lionhead definitely knew that. They set up a website where you could upload your movies for the whole world to see. It sounds like a brilliant idea, and it was. Unfortunately, it came just a bit too early. The game itself wasn't a big success. PC gaming wasn't in a good way then, and perhaps the premise was just that little bit too niche. And because of that, the site didn't catch on either. Transplant the movies into 2007, and well, where do you think all those videos of people making their own movies would have ended up? The movies, alas, just missed out on taking advantage of a video sharing website that would have ended up being used by everybody. Maybe that would have sold the game. But alas, the game was a misfire that disappointed for both Lionhead and Activision. It wasn't the only one. 2005's Black and White 2, as previously mentioned, was also a disappointment. Perhaps it added a bit too much and changed a bit too much about something that was already a really good thing. Perhaps there was too much responding to the eventual criticism of Black and White that it just wasn't enough of a game, and in trying to make it more of a game, they kind of took away what was special about it. And well, the shine was already off the original anyway by this point.
The first thing is, you know, just to have some awesome technology
and to put that into a strong gameplay game. And that was the problem with Black and White 1. It's some awesome technology, but where was the game there? And we really wanted to put the game in.
And that is the Molyneux cycle. Tell us the next game is going to be amazing, while the last game was rubbish.
Sales for the sequel were once again just below expectations, and that signalled the end of Lionhead and indeed Peter Molyneux's long relationship with Electronic Arts. Such expensive flops take their toll, and Lionhead were at this point starting to flounder behind the scenes. In public though, they were triumphant, having released the first chapter of their biggest series, the thing that Molyneux would describe as the best game ever, the absolute killer app for Microsoft's Xbox. They were firmly in the grip of the monster. Fable was originally known as Project Ego and was at first the product of a Lionhead satellite studio, one of a few that Molyneux set up agreements with in the early 2000s. Big Blue Box Games, a studio that started out in 1997 in the wake of Molyneux's departure from Bullfrog and was filled with Bullfrog alumni, in particular Simon and Dean Carter, the original creators of Project Ego. They had their own young guns too, like John McCormack, who had gone to become a big part of Lionhead in the years to come. The aim was an open-ended, open-world RPG where you could be whoever you wanted to be, pretty much. An RPG that was all about your character. It might be surprising to some, considering just how often Molyneux would hype the game up to ridiculous degrees, that the genesis of Fable actually didn't lie with Molyneux. But he certainly embraced the idea quickly, and Fable would become their next big ace in the hole. Molyneux gave Big Blue Box the green light to keep on working, to take that original premise, to ride it into the sun and sell it to publishers, which they did. The satellite studio idea at first seemed innocuous. As we will see, it was the start of Lionhead changing forever. Ultimately, Big Blue Box found a publisher in Microsoft, who felt that Fable might just be the RPG that the Xbox needed. In fact, they absolutely loved everything about it. Fable was, for Microsoft, a potential major player. And once again, in the early 2000s, the hype train started to trundle as Molyneux, at least in public, took the game by the reins.
It's taken a while, and Fable has been in the making now for 4 years, and we're only just confident enough now to start showing it off.
Yeah.
And,
I mean,
you could be down in the bottom of a town, and one of the townsfolk says, "Can you rescue the girl on top of the cliff?" You look up there, and there's Eric the Bloodslayer going up the rescue. You think, "Oh no, he's going to get all the credit for that."
And Lionhead, well, it just grew bigger and bigger. At the time of Black and White, the studio was at around about 30 or so people, and that number would soon treble after it. It also made sense eventually to buy Big Blue Box outright so that the 30-man team would actually have a fighting chance of completing Fable. They now joined forces with Lionhead. There was another Lionhead satellite in the winds, Intrepid, who were working on a game called BC.
BC, you have a tribe, you want to have the tribe grow, which is by getting them food, shelter, all the kind of classic Neanderthal things you need to do to live.
Add it all up and there's around 150 or so people working for the company, perhaps closer to 200. And yes, they're working on more than one game. In 2002 you had Big Blue Box on Fable, Intrepid on BC, a team on something called Dimitri, and teams for both Black and White 2 and the movies. Later on it was also announced that Jeff Minter and Llamasoft were working with Lionhead to develop a typically Minter-esque psychedelic sort of game called Unity. Remember that Molyneux had promised that Lionhead would never work on more than one game? Or that there would never be more than 20 people working there? Molyneux's promises at the start of Lionhead, as honourable as they might have been, simply never had a chance of being fulfilled. In these days and times, working with such big publishers on such big games, it was impossible. It seemed as though Fable also at various points didn't have a chance. The reason why I refer to it as a monster is not because I wish to bag on it, it's because it almost grew unmanageable, beyond anyone's control. Because remember, games evolve here, that's always been the philosophy. But it's almost as if no one realised just how big the game was actually going to become. They underestimated just how much would have to go into a game like Fable. With the best will in the world, the 30-strong team at Big Blue Box would have never had a hope in hell of completing it. but joining forces with Lionhead caused problems of its own, as people who wanted to make a more simulation-style, traditionally Lionhead game balked at the idea of creating an RPG. This didn't describe everybody, but it still caused the odd bit of friction. And of course, there were more casualties, chief amongst them being BC. There just wasn't enough resources to dedicate to this Dawn of Mantastic tribal evolution strategy game, something that was very Lionhead indeed, and it was finally cancelled in late 2004 or so, maybe before. Its demise meant that the satellite studio behind it, Intrepid, also bit the dust. Project Dimitri, something we'll eventually get to, also found itself cancelled, not for the first time, and not for the last time. Unity, the Jeff Minter project, also ended up out of this dimension and out of existence. And the games that we did see? Black and White 2 and the movies both, if anything, suffered from a lack of focus thanks to Fable. It was almost seen as a blessing at points by the teams if Peter's focus wasn't on either game, but they were both somewhat disorganised in development. It was all about the monster, and it needed to feed. If you feel that those games suffered, chances are Fable was the reason why. And of course in the end, there is the publisher who just wants a game. Fable had been hyped for years now, and you can only call it the best game ever so much before finally, people just want a fucking game. Lionhead, the company that didn't believe in deadlines, would find themselves with a concrete deadline for Gold Masters from Microsoft that must be met or the project is over. And while a lot had been achieved on Fable, from combat to modelling and plenty of tricks, it was still not exactly a game yet at this point.
If you press it, you can go, shit. So when we're playing cooperative, quite often we walk down as a band and we go, shit, motherfucker, shit. And we're just sort of rapping, doing our own rap.
The final year of Fable's development may well go down as the most punishing and brutal death crunch in the history of the whole video game industry, as the ailing Big Blue Box, Lionhead and Microsoft worked together to basically do the tech equivalent of pushing a big steamship up an even bigger freaking hill. It's up to you whether or not you wish to picture Molyneux as Fitzcarraldo. Creative meetings, annual leave, time away from the studio? These things did not happen. There was nothing but the crunch, the act of trying to tame this monster into something of a game, 18 hours a day, every day, for a whole year. Some didn't make it. A lot of people were spent mentally, physically and spiritually. The crunch is a controversial subject in this business, and for the biggest piece of evidence for the case against, look no further than Fable and what it did to the people who worked on it. The crunch made a Sports Direct warehouse look like a vape shop in Shoreditch. In the end, Fable made it, but the damage was done. Big Blue Box was essentially no more, a 30-person studio that swelled to around 70 during Fable's crunch. It basically burst, and a lot of those people left Lionhead and even the games industry, some of them for years, some of them for good. Lionhead itself was changed by the experience, and most would say that it wasn't for the better. The vision of a small independent studio was now a distant, almost comedic memory. And as we will see, Peter Molyneux himself, and the perception of Molyneux, was changed forever. We have seen nothing but positive about him so far. This is the turning point. We'll get to that though. Before that, we have to look into the monster's eyes and examine Fable itself. For now though, I leave you with the most apt closing line to a famous monologue I can think of. Cue Captain Quint.
Anyway, we delivered the bomb.
Fable is, at its core, an action RPG. Simple and solid combat, rolling around at enemies and all that. And all that stuff works just fine, just as it did in Ocarina of Time or whatever. But it's a deeper game than that. It did promise a lot of freedom after all, as well as all those choices, to do a good deed or a bad deed. Even the Guildmaster at the end of the tutorial doesn't seem to be too bothered about you possibly going on to be an evil bastard. Which is, well, hey ho. Karma was already a thing in RPGs all the way back to Dungeons and Dragons, and sometimes it was used for exciting grey areas. But this feels a bit more like that old video game classic. Punching a bully? Good! Punching the bullied kid for no reason? Bad. It all appears to be a bit binary. How will being good or being evil actually affect the world in the grand scheme of things? that can be a little questionable. Not that choosing your path isn't fun, and you can certainly be extremely angelic or extremely evilly evil, but it's perhaps not quite what was promised. Just looking at the game though in 2016, it's perhaps not wise to get too hung up on those promises. We will get to them. Fable is a very good action RPG with a lot of neat stuff attached. The thing that strikes me a lot about the game is the personality of it, how cities actually do feel lived in and occupied by people. Even the smallest of NPCs actually feels like a proper person and everything. It's in direct contrast to something like Elder Scrolls that's never gotten past its reputation for being robotic and stilted. I also really dig games where your reputation does matter and things that you do get commented on, and Fable does that very well indeed. I seem to have acquired the nickname of Chicken Chaser just through following traditional Zelda-esque tropes and attacking chickens whenever I see them. I never had to even seek it out at all.
Aw, Chicken Chaser. Look at the chicken.
In fact, just talking about the comments and the like does the world of Fable injustice. This game's world is beautifully realised, and it actually does feel like you have an effect on it. People won't just call you a hero, they'll actually follow you around. They'll get haircuts and clothes just like yours. Or they'll run away in fear. And again, as in Black and White, I appreciate that Lionhead don't do slider bars. How you look, your physique and what have you, depends on how you play and how well you do. Use swords and you'll become big and strong, be stealthy and you'll be wiry in life, and so on. It's things like this that are appreciated, and really separate the game from, again, something like Elder Scrolls. As much as I do like Elder Scrolls, it seems like you're purely in search of a honorific title at times, and aside from that it's almost as if you don't exist. There's almost too much freedom. This is controlled, but naturally so. And there's so much fun stuff to seek out everywhere, including lots of cool minigames like frickin' coin golf. I could do stuff like this for hours. I appreciate that this isn't a full review, and I'm not going to do the whole thing justice in all this time, but Fable does what it does very well. If you could call this a first impression, almost, then it's a very good one indeed. There's another thing that Fable has that wasn't all that common. A certain Britishness about it. Plenty of quirks here and there, a definite sense of humour and playfulness. For all the horrors that happened in its development, you don't really notice it in the main game. And it is just, in the end, quite a lot of fun to play. Breezing through the main quest might be a slog, but as with any game like this, the fun comes in just immersing yourself in the town, looking into the side quests, and relaxing into the experience. Little things here and there like proper merchant systems, buying up houses or courting folk make it even easier to do that. And it is just quite solid mechanically. It's fun to have a fight, it's fun to cast spells, it's fun to just travel the world. It's a very good action RPG indeed, and the reviews were excellent. So, why were people so angry? Well, there's one answer for that. Something to do with a guy who is by now on the verge of finally going completely bald. Whenever Fable gets brought up, Molyneux's promises must be mentioned, because whoo boy did they cause controversy. As he'd done for most other games, he'd been in the press a lot and said a bunch of high profile shit, getting het up about the game, all emotional and stuff. And saying stuff that, well, didn't quite end up happening. There were three things in particular. The first was that Fable would have multiplayer, which it didn't.
The other thing I should say is, we can't really demonstrate it here, Fable can be played up to 4-player, multiplayer cooperatively. All you do is you take your joypad out, plug it in there, no setup screens, you're in the world.
Will you be able to show it today, or is it
we can't
just
really
too
show it
buggy?
today?
The second was that you could get married in Fable, which you could, and have children, which you couldn't.
And definitely in this game, you can chat up women, you can even get married, and you can have children. I won't go into the details of how you do that.
Okay.
We will see a lot of...
Yeah.
The third was that you could plant an acorn, and over the course of the game, that acorn would grow into a tree. Which it didn't, and you couldn't. Which one do you think caused the biggest kerfuffle? That bloody acorn. It is kind of odd. The two other things seem like pretty important features and mechanics that didn't make it or ever had a chance to. It's known that Molyneux announcing multiplayer, for example, wasn't known by Lionhead at all when it happened, and apparently caused a huge panic. This is one of the first visible examples of a rather shitty Molyneux practice. He didn't have a script or a filter. He could blab things, major things that weren't necessarily a part of the plan, that basically just came from his head, and all of a sudden that's out worldwide. Not good for already very stressed people. Usually Peter could be dialed back, of course, but the damage was already done. And in the wake of Fable's release, people focused on that icon. Fans of the game in fact raised a massive stink about it, saying that in general Fable was not anywhere near the immersive open world experience it was supposed to be, and more like a souped up action RPG with some cute tricks and morality. The acorn was the symbol of that, even if it was more like a cute feature than something actually important, like the other two would have been. Let alone the less mentioned fact that this open world RPG was a game where you could be exactly the person you wanted to be, good or evil, but not male or female. The general point is, Peter Molyneux's hype actually damaged Fable by making it out to be something it wasn't fully going to be, as opposed to the really good game that it actually was. The result of this was that Peter Molyneux ended up delivering a personal apology on Fable's forums, filled with statements that would become familiar during just about every Lionhead game's post-mortem. Talking about how excited he gets, using his not great coding knowledge to explain reasons why X feature isn't in the game, and saying that perhaps he shouldn't talk about these things as much, essentially that he should become more conventional instead of excitedly talking about games that are years away, still embryonic. It all appears heartfelt, but is it genuine? Is Molyneux trying to present himself as someone outside of the system to make up for a game's shortcomings? Molyneux, outside the system, of all people? Is all that just a poor attempt at technobabble to obfuscate other issues? It almost reads sometimes as if he is, in part, trying to make people feel bad for having such a go at him. This wasn't the first time that Molyneux had promised a little too much, and it sure as hell wouldn't be the last, but this was one of the first major high-profile examples. And so, despite everything, even the successful and really good game that Lionhead had created, Fable caused a significant dent in the reputation of Peter Molyneux. And honestly, I'm not sure if he ever truly recovered from it. That icon had a lot to frickin' answer for.
We had this simulation and kids get up and they go to school and they go back. To my horror, I went into testing, this is about a year ago, and I went into testing, I looked at someone's screen and they were all dead.
However, regardless of anything that Molyneux had said, the promises he'd made that weren't delivered on, the long development and brutal crunch, one thing was certain. Fable was, deservedly, a huge hit. And so was 2005's expanded edition, Fable: The Lost Chapters. It was the fastest selling game in the history of the Xbox at that point, won numerous awards, and went on to sell 3 million copies worldwide. The only franchise that was more important than Fable to Microsoft was Halo. The monster had done good, and it was here to stay. In 2005, Lionhead could count as many as 300 people among their numbers. And despite the success, Lionhead were in a troubling position because they were just too big. The studio was becoming impossible to manage, and thanks to a humongous wage bill, impossible to profit from. The success of Fable was offset greatly by the relative failures of Black and White 2 and the movies, or the losses generated through cancelled projects. Molyneux himself is in an awkward position again, unable to maintain control of a ship in heavy waters. He wasn't any good at this whole management thing. The studio was, bluntly put, not making enough money to sustain itself. It had spread itself way, way too thin. The main cause of all this mess happened in 2001, when Lionhead tried to float on the stock market. They'd been told by experts that doing so could make their company worth a ton of cash, almost $500 million in fact. With big pound signs in their eyes, Molyneux, Webley and the rest of the management set out to do it. Preparations for flotation included buying up Big Blue Box and Intrepid and expanding the studio. This was also when the one game at a time idea was totally abandoned, as it was important to have a lot of potentially successful properties in the pipeline, expanding the studio more. But no worries, because the flotation would cover it. It all looked good, everything was ready. And then 9/11 happened. The stock market in general went to hell, and floating the company would have at that point been madness. The plans to float bit the dust. But all the agreements were still in place, and suddenly that money that was going to cover them wasn't going to be there. From that point on, Lionhead had to rely on venture capitalist investment, and frankly, they struggled from that point on. With only one success out of the next 3 games following on from that, and their resources drained for an expansion that no longer had a purpose, it became clear eventually that they were not going to recover from this blow without taking drastic action. The solution? Well, it's almost a case of history repeating. The independent studio dream was over, and it was time to either make massive cuts, which Molyneux was not prepared to do, at least not himself, or sell up. The 2 interested parties were Ubisoft and Microsoft. The former road paints an odd future, where we'd have likely seen Fable sequels on all next-gen platforms, while Microsoft's interest was based utterly in securing a prized product for the Xbox line alone. This wasn't all that similar to Bullfrog aside from the sale itself. Whereas Bullfrog were the hottest property on the market and could sell to anybody, for Lionhead, securing a deal was about securing the company's future. The way things were, they could have gone under in spectacular fashion. In the end, Microsoft won the day, meaning that Fable and all other Lionhead products would be Xbox and Xbox 360 exclusive. It is not known exactly how much Microsoft paid for Lionhead, but it is known to be a lot less than the $375 million they'd paid for Rare a couple of years previous. Apparently, it was a bargain. Fable, the monster, had almost killed Lionhead, and at the same time, it ended up saving Lionhead. And so Lionhead's independent years came to an end. In the third part of this trilogy, we will look at the Microsoft years, or alternatively, the Fable years. And as for Peter Molyneux, well, the worst is yet to come. Somewhere in the second part, Peter Molyneux plateaued. Perhaps it was just after the release of Black and White, the point where his reputation could get no higher, the high watermark where the wave broke. In the years after that, the ground that he was on began to shake, and at one point he could have fallen off, right into the mouth of an uncontrollable monster called Fable. Originally the story of Lionhead was going to be covered in just one video, but it's too big for that, and there's 2 noticeable halves separated by what happened at the end of the last video, Lionhead being sold to Microsoft. The second half of Lionhead is, well, a bit more depressing than the first. There is a reason this series is called The Rise and Fall of Peter Molyneux after all. And yes, even if it's not in this video, we will eventually get to 22 cans. For now though, we return to where we left things. As per the barcode on their forehead, Lionhead are now the property of Microsoft. Let the role-playing games begin. In the fallout from the original Fable, and the deal that followed it, there were some definite winners and losers. One person who hasn't been mentioned up to this point was Louise Copley, who ended up managing the project, and has often been credited with saving the game from oblivion. She, like Andy Robson, was someone who could actually keep people's, or rather Molyneux's, focus on just finishing the damn game and not adding any more to it.
I think what I've learnt is that every time you finish a game, there's 100 things you want to do differently again, and you come up with loads of ideas. So, I mean, we're really proud of every Fable that we've done.
The Carters and the rest of the Big Blue Box team weathered one hell of a storm and saw their vision right through to a deservedly successful end, even if the studio itself paid the price.
A really interesting thing to be able to look at where the hero is at the end of somebody's game and see how they've played the game. You're not very good at combat, that's where you've got scars and things, and that's why you're kind of battle scarred. Or you use far too much magic, which is why you're slowly going bald.
Microsoft as a whole for once have to be considered a monster good. They believed in Fable enough to give Big Blue Box all the resources they needed in order to finish it. If it wasn't for their support as publishers, the game would have never come out. Of course, in doing that, it was pretty clear that Lionhead and Microsoft's futures would be forever intertwined. Amongst the losers were largely the core of Lionhead itself. People like John T. Barnes, Mark Healy, basically most of the black and white team, were suddenly marginalised and not really working on anything. Andy Robson also found himself out in the cold somewhat. Lionhead Originals were given a bit of a short shrift, particularly after the deal where Microsoft bought Lionhead for, frankly, not a lot of money in the grand scheme of things. These people were somewhat unhappy at Lionhead's clear new direction. The management themselves, thanks to the misguided flotation attempts, redundancies and venture capitalists, ended up arguably selling Lionhead for a lot less than it was potentially worth. And in the public eye, well, no one was a bigger loser more than Molyneux himself, whose careless talk almost scuppered the whole project and almost made Fable something that should be praised with caveats, as opposed to something that should have been praised purely for being a fantastic game. It was a harsh lesson, and as we'll see, it was one that Molyneux wouldn't learn quickly. Or at all.
No, I don't think anyone else in the whole industry goes out there and talks about concepts when they're still concepts, and I do, partially because I have a big mouth and I get very excited, but I will admit I'm going to try and curb my enthusiasm in future and then tell you about features that are locked.
Gradually in the mid-2000s, and especially following the Microsoft deal, a lot of the Lionhead originals started to leave. Andy Robson took himself away to form a company called Testology, purely focused on external testing of games, although this company would still work a lot with Lionhead. Mark Healy, Alex Evans, David Smith and Karima Tooney found themselves working together on a Healy-led independent game named Ragdoll Kung Fu, and from there they left Lionhead in 2006 to form Media Molecule Games. They wouldn't do too badly, what with going on to create Little Big Planet and all that. John T. Barnes, after 17 years in the Molyneux domain, left in 2006 and ended up joining Bungie as a director of production, where he remains to this day. Adrian Moore also left, the guy behind the movies. He joined up with Pandemic for a time. A lot of things changed at Lionhead, and they certainly lost a fair bit of talent. And again, a lot of this had to do with the monster. After all, Microsoft's purchase of Lionhead came with some conditions. You get some money now, but you only get the rest on successful completion of both Fable 2 and 3, released on time to boot. From that point on, it was pretty clear that there wasn't going to be much else aside from Fable, and so a lot of originals respectfully took their bow. Still, a lot of people stayed, buoyed by the prospect of keeping their jobs and of the support that Microsoft could offer. Lionhead as a whole changed, from boys club mosh pit to professional game studio. The whole of Occam Court was now theirs, the walls were given a new coat of paint, chicken chow mein was replaced with fresh food from the canteen, everybody got an Xbox 360, and as Lionhead employee Ted Timmins amusingly put it, every PC now had a legitimate copy of Windows. Lionhead had weathered the storm, even if they hadn't come out of it how they entered it. And so it seems like a good time for Peter Molyneux to start talking about dogs.
Gamers, casual gamers, everybody who sees that dog, they will say, that's a dog. I understand him. I understand when he's excited, I understand when he's sad, I understand when he's happy, I understand when he's hurt. He looks like a real dog.
It was thought that creating Fable 2, now that the groundwork was there, wouldn't be as tough a task as the original, even as the series was jumping to the 360. Still, it wasn't like Lionhead to just do more of the same. There were two things that Molyneux mandated. The first thing was that the sometimes controversial, more progressive elements of the original must not only be retained, but enhanced. The original was noted for having several strong characters of colour, as well as a gay character, even if it meant that the odd person or magazine called Lionhead Satanists for it. And no, they actually did. The second was to literally shoot the dog. The hero must have a dog, and that dog dies. Some say that this was inspired by Molly's own experiences. Not too long back, his two dogs had wandered on somebody's land and had ended up being shot. One survived, the other died.
Now your dog can get hurt. The dog will always try and catch up with you. He'll always try and be by your side. He loves you so completely. Even if it takes him hours and hours, he'll try and catch up. And we'll heal him now because it really upsets me.
What with this, Mark Webley's hamster dying as soon as the company was named after him, and Andy Wobson murdering the hell out of his Tamagotchi, it seems as though poor Peter doesn't have the best of luck with pets. But oddly enough, it all seems to go back into his games.
But it's a role-playing game which is very different to other role-playing games. It's got some totally new inventions in it. It's got this thing that's called a dog. You can hear him in the background there. He's a completely piece of artificial intelligence.
Indeed, of all the Fable games, Fable 2 is the one where Molyneux was the most hands-on by far. He was pulled from all angles by too many projects at the time of the original after all. He balanced this all with another new hat. Not long after the purchase of Lionhead, Peter Molyneux was named as the new creative director of Microsoft Games Europe. For the second time, he had risen to a very powerful position in a big company, meaning that he was one of the most visible faces for Microsoft and the Xbox as a whole over here. It even meant that he could hold influence over other companies in the Microsoft Europe umbrella, including Ware. So yes, there's lots more onerous duties. Fable 2's development went relatively smoothly until, of course, the end, where once again it went a little chaotic. There was another crunch period. Not as bad as the last, but with less than a year to go, the sequel was once again barely a game. The hardened road-ready Lionhead team, still largely made up of the hands who'd made the original, saw it through, and the sequel to Fable was released in 2008, the game where you, the hero, can choose your destiny again. Only even more so. And you can marry anybody, do anything. Hell, you can even pick your gender.
You know, I've got mixed emotions about this. Sometimes I want to take Fable and lock it in a cupboard and say, no, you can never have a look at it, just because, you know, it's been so long. But I'm in Fable 2, I'm desperate to open the doors and show people what it's got, because never before have I worked on a game that we actually have not really talked about all the features.
The thing about Fable that is both quite good and frustrating in equal measure is that while all Fable games take place in the same world of Albion, they're all different in many ways. For a start, Fable 2 is set nearly 500 years after the events of the first game, in a time that's architecturally similar to England in the late 17th century or so. The environments have beefed up accordingly, with all your favourite towns getting bigger and generally feeling different. It's a bit faster to get going too, after the usual kiddie tutorial bum flufferys and the like, which is a bit welcome. And also, geez, there's a hell of a lot of voice talent here. You'll recognise a lot of the voices if you've watched basically any British telly at all. There's Stephen Fry, Zoe Wanamaker, Sean Pertwee, James Corden, and even the almighty East End Fug.
Oh, crap. Do you know what I had to do to get those Beatles? I'll remember this, kid. You can fuck off to Tibet. And I shall have men, nutters, from Parkhurst, dressed in Yeti suits, up Everest, with
that
meat
was a
cleavers, ready to chop your
massacre.
tarty fucking
No
legs off.
mercy for the filth.
There's a lot of changes in the gameplay too. The combat, while good in the original, undergoes a big overhaul, with the focus being on very fast one-button combat. It's simple and certainly designed to appeal to casual players, but I find it works quite well. I like switching seamlessly from swords to projectiles to spells. The spells also have a lot more variety this time around, and they honestly feel a lot more essential to this game than they did to the original, where it was more just use them or don't. In Fable 2, even the most physical character is going to get a lot of use out of spells like the Force Push, and yes, it is called that outright, to deal with the much bigger crowds of enemies. The appearance of your character will still change depending on what you specialise in though. Fable 2 is also Lionhead's most HUD-less game since the first Black and White, with virtually nothing on screen except the D-pad prompts and a little energy bar, which certainly adds to the immersion. The only thing that I don't like, honestly, is the big old glowing breadcrumb trail that's always coming from the character. It's almost naggy-like, hey, stop screwing around and go over there already, and it's never not there. Fable 2 still features a ton of side quests and the like, and plenty of opportunities for screwing around, but that breadcrumb just gets in the way and is kind of annoying. Personally, I would prefer a minimap. As far as the screwing around goes though, you can do a lot. Fable 2 allows you to literally buy every single house, shop in the entire game. You can live out those psycho land baron dreams, marking a house as owner for death and then buying it up for cheap. or just getting a nice little abode for you and your family, or families. And you can marry absolutely anybody. Albion got gay marriage sorted out a long time ago. The whole courting process of doing expression after expression or just giving loads of gifts out is kind of repetitive though. Once you know what to do, you can get someone to love you forever in 5 minutes, a lot of the people anyway. I miss the days when you used to actually take your partner out on a proper date, pick a restaurant and, you know, do drive-bys and stuff. Still, you can have children this time, and getting married can be worth it because it does actually offer some benefits. It is odd though, Fable 2's way of working, while almost insulting in its simplicity, still has a weird charm about it depending on exactly what you're expecting out of the games, which is something I'm yet to fully figure out. But of course there is the wee doggy, who will follow you forever. You can teach the dog tricks, he'll help you in combat, and he'll help you find stuff in the world, buried treasure and the like. And also he will, generally, act like a dog. You can even pet it or scold it, although there's usually no reason to actually scold the dog beyond just being a shit. I like how the dog actually does all these weird dog things. It makes him feel a bit more real than, I don't know, Dogmeat from Fallout 3. And yes, he does play quite a significant part in the ending of the game. The dog is nice. He never leaves you, but he never gets in the way too much, which is a relief. There are other little progressive things too. Eating nothing but veggies in Fable 2 not only makes you healthy, but it increases your purity. Remember, Molly and the team wished to spite those who complained about similar things in the original. And it worked out okay. Fable 2 is one of probably a very few games to get a special recommendation from, of all places, Peter, mainly thanks to the dog. Regardless of all that though, Fable 2 is really quite good, especially if you like good action in an RPG as well as choosing your own destiny. There are some changes that I'm not a huge fan of, and I would like it if the game was that little bit less buggy, but when it's good, it's really good. It improves on the original in quite a few ways, and there's so much beef to the game that it will happily last you a long time if you want it to. While it's only available on the Xbox 360, it's probably still worth playing now. Not just for being a beautiful game, but for playing really well too and just giving you plenty of scope to build a character as you see fit and do it naturally. Which in the end is what I really do like a lot about Fable as a whole. If I had to choose, then I would probably still pick the first game over it, but it is very good indeed. Mind you, I do wonder if old Molly said anything silly in connection with this game, like he did with the first. Well, geez, what do you think?
I kind of hit it slightly aggressively with a rather large stick. It kind of looked like I was beating the dog, but she physically turned round, and you know, it was a physical reaction. It wasn't, she hadn't thought about it, it was physically she'd reacted, as if she'd seen a dog hit in real life.
Yes, once again we have to talk about Molly's promises. Unbelievably, we even have to talk about an acorn again. Wishing to make up for the original, Molly spoke of a golden acorn that would grow, as you progressed through the game, into this giant oak tree. He spoke of it earnestly. You almost want to shout at Molly to stop bloody hitting himself. Ditch that acorn already. Still, the kid gloves were on. After the first game, that acorn was almost treated like a running joke. And hell, the acorn actually did sort of make it in, although it was hardly a gameplay feature, probably not like Molyneux made it out to be.
And some things, you know, the trees growing from little acorns to big oak trees just didn't make sense in gameplay. You had no way of interacting with those trees, and like 15% of the process time was just maintaining the trees. What would you rather have? You know, more cool effects on the hero or growing trees? And okay, that is a promise. It wasn't so much a promise, it's an idea that was laid down that didn't make sense.
People were, if anything, more concerned by the game's somewhat buggy nature. There was a lot of crap still in there that hadn't been fixed. But you could have children now, and you could play with a friend, although the multiplayer was rather limited and perhaps not again what Molly said it was going to be, with ghosts running about the world and heroes actually interacting with each other.
What makes that even more powerful for the story and for the game itself is when you visit someone else's game, because this is completely dynamic co-op over live, because you can walk up to people in your world who are playing their single player games on their machines in the form of these ghosts and leap into someone else's world. It's only when you're in that other person's world
gee, people really like you and they hate me.
You're more like a henchman in another person's world and little more. Bog standard, shoehorned in co-op that didn't add a whole lot to the game.
When I worked on Fable 1, I told the world about every single feature, every single experiment. I talked excitedly about everything in Fable 1. So with Fable 2, I've been very careful to button my blabbering lips and only talk about things that I could show, first of all, and secondly, to leave things like the story and what you can do in the world and how the world interacts with things for you to discover, so that I don't overpromise and the game overdelivers.
That said, Fable 2 was largely a triumph, even more so than the first game. It wasn't nearly as controversial this time around, and the reception was almost universally positive. Fable 2 would eventually go on to be the top-selling RPG on the Xbox 360, and the game won several awards. Peter Molyneux himself was, once again, for a short time at least, at a high point. Lionhead had come out from a rough patch, reinforced and stronger than ever seemingly following the deal with Microsoft. He himself was now one of the company's most powerful people, at least in Europe. And even his reputation was well on the way to being mended, because if there is one truth in the industry, it's that just about all bullshit can be forgiven if you're making really good games. Keep this in mind while we go over the next 8 years. If ever there was a point for Peter Molyneux to gracefully take a back seat and go behind the scenes, this was it. If he'd have done that, this video series would have been utterly revenant, and Peter Molyneux would unquestionably be a legend. There would be no rise and fall. Obviously that didn't happen.
The computer game industry needs to invent new stuff more than ever before. I think this year, 2009, is going to be the year that we turn around and say, hey, this is the moment when it really started happening. And although everyone everyone here turns around and thinks we're successful, that's nothing compared to what we're going to be.
The development of Fable 3 began in much the same way as the second game did, with Molyneux laying out initial design decisions and what have you before going off to do his own thing and leaving the team to it. This time around, the idea was accessibility. A dangerous word, to be honest, but we'll see just what it meant.
I love the fact of collecting stuff and, feeling my collections and customization. I love that stuff. But I hate the techiness and the fiddliness and the sort of billion choices of, there's 150 things that you can change about your character. I hate that sort of stuff. So
generally though, the development team for Fable 3 were looking forward to a good, easy production. After all, the groundwork's all in place. Just improve on Fable 2. Of course, that didn't happen. What did happen was that right near the development's end, Molyneux crashed through the door with all the elegance of a man who's had 10 pints and a curry and demanded tons of changes to the game.
We've got a completely new GUI system. I know this sounds boring, but those two-dimensional lists that role-playing games have, I hate.
For example, Fable 3 has a system called the Road to Wall, which is basically a levelling up system. This was added in May of 2010, and the game was released in October. Prior to that, the game didn't even have a levelling up system.
It's this long path that winds away into the distance, and in the distance you can just see this castle. That is your objective, to walk along that path to your destination, which is a castle, and when you get to the castle, you're ready to lead the revolution.
There was an utterly abortive attempt to add integration with the 360's new toy, the Kinect, that was never going to work out. The last months of development were chaos, with other elements of the game, like the finish, going almost totally ignored, which you can certainly see in the finished game. And of course there was Peter Molyneux in public hyping the game up, once again by diminishing the previous game, and even going so far as to say that virtually everything about Fable 2 was rubbish.
Giving the creative direction that I gave on Fable 2 and making the big mistakes that I made, and I just stand in front of a mirror and just punch myself in the face until I kind of pass out.
Which it obviously isn't, certainly not when compared with Fable 3. And that clashed somewhat with his previous opinion that Fable 2 was one of the best games he'd ever done. At least he didn't start going on about bloody acorns this time around. And so alarm bells might just be ringing. But obviously people didn't really know about all this in 2010, All they knew was that Fable 3 was just around the corner, and so it was time once again to try and figure out just how much of what Molyneux was saying was believable, and how much of it was clearly rubbish. Anywho, it hit the shelves on time, in October of 2010. Again, later in the day, people connected to the game, including Molly himself, would say that the game needed at least another 6 months, or even another year of development. But hey, that doesn't mean that what's actually here doesn't have any chance of being good, right? Oh dear. Fable 3 moves the timeline even further forward, another 50 years, to a time in Albion that can be best described as akin to the British Industrial Revolution. It's getting gradually more modern now. You are the son or daughter of the second game's hero, and you're the heir to the throne. Your brother, the king, is a bastard who is hell-bent on ruling through fear, and this causes you to end up leading a revolution against him. Because naturally you can use the guild seal, meaning of course that you are a hero. You must overthrow your brother and then rule the land yourself, eventually saving Albion from the big ultra-bastard force that's behind everything. Sounds suitably fantastical, right? I mean, at least you don't have to spend an hour playing as a little child again, I suppose. The best word to describe Fable 3 is linear. Now don't get me wrong, there was a certain linearity about the first two games, and they were never quite as open world and free as they promised to be, but there was still a lot of immersion there. Here, it's totally lacking in all those departments. It doesn't really feel like an RPG at all, more like an action-adventure with a few elements that are just there because it's Fable and it's expected. You can buy houses and you can do menial jobs and play pub games and all that, but is there all that much of a reason to bother beyond dull grinding? It doesn't feel worth it anymore, or all that interesting. The most damning example is the aforementioned Road to Wall, which is just that. One road, blocked off by gates, where you use seals to buy near enough every upgrade in the game. Remember when you used to actually find these things out in the world? Nah, that wasn't going to cut it anymore. Have this shit instead. The road was built in about 3 weeks on a Molyneux whim. And guess what? It's not a surprise. It's not the only baffling change. There's also the Sanctuary, because somebody decided that plain old menus are just plain bad. Wonder who. This replaces them, a chamber where you actually have to run about to access the stuff you want and listen to Basil fucking Faulty yammer on endlessly while you're trying to get to the bloody save button. Why does this exist? Like, at all? Were menus deemed not immersive enough? Suppose so. And so we get this unworkable pile of rubbish that's just totally unwanted. Like, it would be a neat extra, but don't not have a menu system as well. It doesn't make the game any more immersive, it's just a pain in the arse. As far as the actual game goes, it looks nice and everything, but it doesn't feel as though the series has moved on at all. If anything, it's going backwards. Even the combat, something always enjoyable in the past, feels quite sluggish, and a lot of the game just doesn't engage me. As a result, the quirks of Fable, the obvious black and whiteness of the moral choices, the kooky expressions that you now can't just access when you want with the D-pad, the dog, they just feel annoying rather than in any way charming. A lot of the game just doesn't feel thought through at all, and while I've obviously not gone that far, the worst criticisms are usually saved for the final section where you actually do become the king or the queen. Most say it feels utterly tacked on and unnecessary, almost like a compulsory and utterly unwelcome grind at the finish. One wonders how much of this was a part of Molly's big final decisions that everyone had to rush to stick in. We already know that the Road to Wall was, and that's damning enough. Fable 3 is a major disappointment, and quite honestly a rubbish game that seems to wreck all that was good about the previous two. Reviews for it, even the more positive ones, were hardly bursting out with positivity. This was a series that was stagnating rapidly. While Fable 3 didn't sell too badly, with over 5 million copies shipped, the underwhelming critical performance of the game would, in the end, cause the series to lose a lot of momentum. It was frustrating to see the game suddenly become unfocused and not kick on from what Fable 2 had achieved. There was a chance for the series to reach new heights, and it was blown totally. In a time when the other big Western RPGs, your Elder Scrolls, Mass Effects, Fallouts and whatnot were both selling well and getting a lot of critical love, Fable was standing stock still and being thoroughly mediocre. The rise of much more direct competition didn't help. I feel that Fable's place was almost taken in and around 2011 by CD Projekt Red's The Witcher series, from the second game onwards. Another action RPG, not necessarily one with the big open world character trinkets that Fable had, but much more compelling from a story and gameplay perspective. The impact of the Souls games on action RPGs also cannot be overstated, monumental and hugely influential critical smashers that offered things that no other games could. Suddenly there was a great risk of Fable losing its place in the pantheon and not being able to find it again. These games made Fable look utterly behind the times in every regard. In 2014, Molyneux would describe Fable 3 as a train wreck. As much as this is yet another example of the Molyneux cycle at work, it is one that could be considered pretty close to the truth. It all seems too familiar. After a honeymoon period with Microsoft where Lionhead initially appeared to be stronger than ever, all of a sudden they were suffering. Their games appeared to be unfocused, and now it was affecting their moneymaker. Indeed, their sole product. By this time, Lionhead were already known as the Fable Studio. It turns out, of course, that there was quite a big reason for the hodgepodge of Fable 3, and a lot of it was connected to Molyneux himself. Molyneux's intervention was almost chaotic in its nature, and caused no end of stress, and most would agree that the changes made were not exactly for the better. But just what was Peter Molyneux doing for the rest of the time that Fable 3 was in development? Well, let's go all the way back to Project X, which as you may recall was originally mentioned by Molyneux in 1989 and released by Bullfrog as Theme Park in 1994. Or was it? It seems as though Project X is actually always something different, something that Molyneux can allude to, a nascent idea, something which he can tell you nothing about. Maybe the Project X that Molyneux mentioned in 1989 was completely different to the Project X that the winner of that Amiga Power competition was going to be working on in 91. Who knows? After all, there's an even bigger Project X, the one that Molyneux started talking about in the early 2000s, and the one that would become his most high-profile unfinished game. The one that would, in all likelihood, end up causing the Molyneux company cycle to start all over again. This Project X had several code names over the years, but for the longest time it was known as Dimitri, after Peter's godson, and details were, as usual, vague.
When you're working on something as ambitious as Dimitri, and it's so easy to describe what Dimitri is, and I'm just going to be tantalising here, is that if I were to describe it to you, then you would have so many questions about it, and unless I could actually show you the game physically working, and how you do these amazing things, then you just wouldn't believe me. You think I was mad.
People thought that the name referred to Fable 2, but in 2006 he confirmed that Dimitri was unrelated to it. As Lionhead became more and more about all things Fable and nothing else, things went dark. But finally, in 2009, Dimitri, Project X, whatever you wanted to call it, it came in full focus, at E3, as part of Microsoft's press conference, the centrepiece of which was the unveiling of Project Natal, the attempt in those days when the underpowered Wii still ruled the sales market, to bring motion control to the Xbox 360. And Dimitri, now known as Milo, would be the centrepiece of the centrepiece, evolving from what was once a controller-based game to being at the forefront of the motion control boom.
Surely we've been making interactive games for 20 years, haven't we? Or 30 years? Well, no, I don't think we have. Because that thing in our hands, that thing that's evolved in our hands and got more and more complex and got more and more buttons, actually has been the biggest barrier to what we want to create.
The video that Molyneux presented showed a woman naturally interacting with a virtual boy by the name of Milo with no nunchucks required. The woman could say hello and Milo would respond. You could almost hold a conversation with him, it was said. You could get him to perform actions. You could teach him to do all sorts of things.
You've got to put these goggles on.
Goggles?
Put them on like this.
Okay. What? Like that?
Claire has been thrown a pair of goggles. Notice what she did. This wasn't acted. She felt the need to reach down for those goggles. Now, everybody, every single person that has experienced this reaches down.
because they feel so connected to Milo's world.
Cool.
And yes, it would all be part of a game that was now known as Milo and Kate, with Kate being a dog because, as we've already established with Fable 2, Peter Molyneux had something of a hang-up about dogs. Whether Kate would have ended up meeting the same fate as Fable 2's dog is unconfirmed.
When this came along, that's the time we said, right, okay, can we dare to create a character which anybody interacting with that character would truly believe was alive? And we took that challenge.
This video, amazing as it was, is something that we now know to be kind of smoke and mirrors. Milo and Kate was still quite pre-alpha, the game was not at this stage yet. The video of Milo was taken from the engine, rendered quickly, and the woman faked her interactions. This was not uncommon or even all that wrong. Early in the development of Black and White, when people came to see what was going on at Lionhead, it wasn't uncommon for someone to show something amazing that the computer was apparently doing with their right hand, while their left hand controlled a stealthily hidden mouse. Mark Healy is known to have faked a touchscreen when using this method with the particularly credulous. You could even go all the way back to Populus's creation, where a lot of the hype for the game was generated by a big load of Lego blocks. But Molyneux was really quite excited about Milo and Kate, seemingly more than he'd been about any project for quite some time. At E3 and in the press interviews that followed, the Molyneux factor was ramped up to 11, with Peter gushing about the possibilities of Natal and Milo together. It certainly got people talking.
Now you may look at that video and wonder whether it's true or real, but here's the fact. We're showing this behind closed doors at E3 to a selected audience, and that selected audience will be able to meet Milo themselves, and will be able to talk to Milo and interact with his world. Thank you very much. I hope you agree. This is a landmark in computer entertainment.
But then things went dark and confused. The story itself seemingly finishes quite quickly. In 2010, people wondered why we hadn't heard anything about Milo and Kate at all since the previous year's E3, and they soon found the official line. Oh, that? It was just a tech demo. It's not actually a game that's going to come out for the Kinect. Nah, it wasn't ever a game, to be honest. This naturally caused people to be pissed at Molyneux once more for getting them so hyped up about something that was never actually going to be a game at any point. People who wanted the Kinect to be more than just sports and party games were looking to Molyneux, and they felt as though they'd been duped by him once again. However, in 2016 we now pretty much know the full story of what happened to Milo and Kate, and the struggle that played out over it through 2010. The first worrying sign was in June, when Aaron Greenberg made the first reference to Milo being a tech demo and not something that was going to market. Molyneux publicly refuted this and said that he would be showing more footage of Milo at his TED Talk in July, an event that ended up confusing everything and everyone.
So, he's discovering the garden, you're helping him discover the garden by just pointing out these snails. Very simple at the start. By the way, if you are a boy, it's snails. If you're a girl, it's butterflies. Because what we found was that girls hate snails.
Meanwhile, at E3 that year, the complete absence of Milo, despite being one of the presentation's showcases the previous year, seemingly confirmed what Aaron said, in spite of any Molyneux bullshit.
Is Milo sort of like a tech simulation for E3, or is it going to be made into something bigger, like a game, or will there be some kind of development with it?
These nasty people here, PR policemen that are all around me as we speak, are stopping me talking about the actual game part, but yeah, for sure.
Finally, it was reported in September that Milo had been cancelled, and then confirmed by Alex Kipman in November, who said that the game was never a product, and never announced as a game. At the time, most of what Molyneux said was dismissed as his usual crap. In truth, he, wearing his games designer and Lionhead's boss hat, and Microsoft were at loggerheads throughout 2009 and 2010, because Milo and Kate was, for Molyneux, always destined to be a game. It was his project, and apparently one that he had very strong feelings for. To him, Milo and Kate was what motion control was all about. how motion control and artificial intelligence could work together, hand in hand, to create something unlike anything else. It's that Tamagotchi stewing away in the cup of tea again, forever sticking in his mind, almost as if despite Black and White there was still something left unsaid. Or perhaps it was the most visible shout from Lionhead as a whole, a cry to allow them to make something that didn't have anything to do with bloody Albion for a change. This is the sort of project that Molyneux would openly cry about when he spoke to people, something that for now he saw as his potential magnum opus.
This is a wonderful opportunity where technology at last can be connected with, where I am no longer restrained by the thing that I hold in my hand as far as a computer game is concerned, or by the blandness of not being noticed if you're watching a film or a book. And I love those revolutions, and I love the future that Milo brings. Thank you very much indeed.
Microsoft did not share that vision. Whereas Project Natal was this infinitely capable motion sensor that could recognise anything you did, the eventual result, the Kinect, was focused much more on the social party experience, and the low specs reflected that. They weren't going to be enough for what Milo and Kate had promised. The game itself was always intended to be just a series of vignettes in any case, still minigames, but presented in a different way that allowed for some actual interaction between yourself, Milo and his dog. But even then the Kinect was going to struggle with what Molyneux had envisioned. That original vision of Milo and Kate was also suddenly a stick for people to beat the game with. How would Milo react to a pervert? What will that do for our image? And so forth. While the reality was that nothing whatsoever would have happened due to the design of the game, Molly got defensive, even angry about this, saying that art shouldn't be compromised and so forth. Passionate enough, but it probably didn't help. Molyneux also ended up sidetracked thanks to his creative director of Microsoft Europe hat, which would see him consulting on the likes of Kinect Sports for Rare, while also trying to keep Milo and Kate afloat. It was untenable. And finally it all came to a head. To Microsoft, Kinect was about party games, it wasn't about an emotional connection. And that was that. Microsoft refused to support the product any further, and so it was cancelled. Probably around about the summer of 2010, leaving Molyneux to finally turn his attention towards Fable 3, very late in the game's production cycle. Which probably explains a fair bit about that game. The 50-strong Milo and Kate dev team moved on to 2012's Fable The Journey, a non-Rails Kinect-based game that almost everybody despised and was virtually shunned by Lionhead the moment it was out on the shelves. Something unworkable and completely against the spirit of the series that deserves no more than this unenthusiastic sentence.
Probably piled a stupid amount of money, really, in truth, into building the tech demo for Milo. We built about 3 hours of gameplay. It was fun. It wasn't really a game, it was almost an experience.
But, in one way or another, this was the sad culmination of what had been close to 10 years of work with some of Lionhead's most experienced people. No one was more dissatisfied than Lionhead were. And so, with Molyneux's pet project figuratively and literally taken out to the back of the shed and shot, it's probably pretty easy for you to guess what's going to come next. Once again, Molyneux has grown tired of his company. Once again, Molyneux feels that his creative visions are being compromised. Once again, Molyneux has too many jobs that take him away from what he wants. Once again, the company had grown too big for him to be comfortable. All of what was one for Molyneux with Bullfrog was now one with Lionhead. But there was even more. Peter Molyneux was angry. On one particularly grim day, there was another exodus. Simon and Dean Carter, the originators of Fable, had already left Lionhead in 2011 to form a new studio called Another Place Productions. And one day, Lionhead vets John McCormack, Guillaume Portes and Jérôme Texler announced that they were going to go join them. Molyneux saw red and became a furious, screaming tornado of rage, shouting at them to get out. He was genuinely apologetic afterwards, but the incident was a little endemic of what Lionhead was like at the time. The staff, and indeed Molyneux himself, were frustrated at constantly having to work at the behest of their masters on Fable-based products. Leaving aside Milo and Kate, there were plenty more Lionhead projects that were mooted, but never finished or even close to finished because as much as possible had to go to Fable. Any thought that the third game would have been the end of it was pure comedy, and now Lionhead's signature game was like an anvil tied to a chain round their necks. The last non-Fable game that Lionhead had released was Black and White 2, now almost 7 years old. No one wanted to talk about Albion. The less said about 2012 for Lionhead, the better. Molyneux's press comments became beyond parody. He said that Fable the Journey wasn't going to be on Rails, when it was on Rails.
It's not an on-rail shooter. Here's the truth of the matter. The first word that we wrote on the wall when we were designing this game was the word freedom.
Shut up, Peter. He said that you could look up and see dazzling sights when the game was designed for the player to look straight ahead only. And so on to people who were just not convinced. That is, if there were people around who were actually listening still. But there was a hope for Lionhead that they could make another big Fable RPG, one that would push the game into proper full-on steampunk territory and create another winning single-player experience. But now Microsoft blocked that, saying that they wanted Lionhead to produce a free-to-play game instead. It was this event that reportedly caused McCormack and co. to leave Lionhead for good. And so the inevitable happened. On the 7th of March 2012, Peter Molyneux announced that he would leave Lionhead and his position at Microsoft at the conclusion of Fable the Journey's development. Not exactly the most glittering end after 15 years. Mark Webley, a co-founder of Lionhead with Molyneux, would take the reins. Molyneux revealed shortly after the announcement that he would move to a new independent venture named 22 Cans, although it was at that time unclear just what they would be doing. It would be based in Guildford, and it would consist of a small team, and it would absolutely be a true independent, free of publisher interference. It's all the case of history repeating again. But before we get to any of that though, just what happened to Lionhead? Lionhead's last 4 Molyneux-less years were, for them, in a word, frustrating. Continued attempts to push Fable 4 were rebuffed. In Microsoft's eyes, the franchise had gone as far as it could have gone in single player and commercially, and they wouldn't listen to anything. A remastered edition of the original for its 10th anniversary in 2014 was received okay enough, but few suspected that it would end up being Lionhead's final game. Microsoft basically gave them an ultimatum. You need to make a service game, or the studio gets closed. Free to play, online multiplayer, microtransactions, the whole works. Not necessarily what they wanted. The idea eventually was to repurpose something called Project Opal that was worked on around the end of the Molyneux years to be a new experience under the Fable name. Cause hey, well, if the sword of Damocles is hanging over your head, you'd best stick with a proven seller. The game would be called Fable Legends and would be a 4 versus 1 game pitting 4 heroes against 1 creature master. Sounds simple enough, but Lionhead did want to do something new in the genre that wasn't just copying League of Legends or what have you. Microsoft also wanted to do something new. Fable Legends was expected to be a high quality F2P game, with proper next-gen graphics and all sorts. Later on it was also going to be a flagship title for DirectX 12 and Windows 10, apparently. In trying to do all of these things, naturally they ended up running into difficulties. Problems with the concept that they created and the game's balance that were difficult to fix, the worry about cheating becoming prevalent due to cross-platform play, and a whole load of assets and levels to make. And so the whole thing ended up taking quite a bit of time. Originally mooted for 2015, the game was pushed back to 2016, a move that would prove to be fatal, as by that time the market that Fable Legends was aiming for was really starting to fill up. And top quality graphics was more and more hardly a requirement for a successful free-to-play game. The game did eventually enter closed beta status with the idea that it would be transferred to open beta as soon as the game was given the green light, but it was not to be. At this time, $75 million had been spent on the development of Fable Legends, a staggering amount for such a game when you compare it to the likes of Hearthstone or League of Legends. Pre-release hype was not especially strong, and someone at Microsoft had clearly decided that they weren't likely to make their money back, and that Fable Legends was not going to redefine the entire F2P experience like it was supposed to. On the 7th of March 2016, the hammer fell. Everybody found out at the same time, the staff and the press. Hanno Lemke, the creative director of Microsoft Europe, called a meeting and told the staff that Fable Legends was going to be cancelled, and with that Lionhead Studios were going to be closed down. The atmosphere was as funereal as you could possibly expect it to be. On the 13th of April, Fable Legends closed beta servers were shut off forever, and on the 29th of April, the studio finally closed its doors. It was a shocking and a rather sad end to a once glorious studio. Unlike the stagnant end that Bullfrog had, this was like a sudden bullet to the head. In these times when so much money is always riding on every project and the failure of a single game can usually mean the death of a studio, this one hurt. It really hurt. It leaves a ton of talented people utterly displaced and a big gaping hole in the UK video games industry. 2016 has not been a particularly good year, believe me. But of course, Molyneux was not there. At the same time as Lionhead were working on their abortive final project, the world was coming down around him. In the last part of this series, we will see the true decline and fall of the Molyneux Empire, the not yet finished tragedy of 22 Cans. It's February 2015, and we're at the studios of 22 Cans in Guildford, a place where through the windows you can still see one of Lionhead's many buildings at One Ockham Court. It has, to say the least, been a bad week. A tense Peter Molyneux sits down at his desk for a scheduled phone interview with John Walker, editor of the PC games website Rock Paper Shotgun, that he's not looking forward to. He takes a deep breath before picking up the phone. He asks Walker whether he should just talk, or if the journo has questions. Walker has many questions. A moment passes, the recorder is turned on, and Walker asks the first of them. Peter Douglas Molyneux, OBE. Do you think that you're a pathological liar? Freeze frame. Rewind. We need to go back a little, a couple of years at least. We need to look through the events that led up to a journalist being able to ask someone like Peter Molyneux flat out whether he thinks he's a liar or not. If this question had been asked of Molyneux 5 years ago, the interview would have ended then and there without another word. The journalist in question would have been all but blacklisted by Microsoft. There would be no feature article. But the times, they have changed. Back we go then to 2012, shortly after Molyneux leaves Lionhead to start his new venture, the one where he can finally, truly be independent. 22 Cans. In May he did something pretty cool actually. He gave the keynote speech at the Molly Jam in London, a 48-hour game jam where people made games based off of tweets from the world famous Peter Molyneux Twitter account, something that good old Molly actually found hilarious.
What we need is innovation, and we need to come together and do crazy things, whether they be radioactive babies or blind men walking into lampposts. I don't care what it is. That's what the world wants from us.
He also admitted that a part of his presence there was to look for folks that could potentially be hired for his new setup, but it was fine to see Molyneux being a good sport. And of course it was important for him to do something like this as it made for quite a nice introduction. This is Peter Molyneux entering a new world, an independent world. The Molly Jam is a nice moment, a humanising moment. It's a shame there wouldn't be all that many of these in the times to come.
Ideas are nothing. Us designers are useless individuals without the brilliance of coders and artists and sound people. So, you know, if anyone wants to work at 22 Cans, P. Molyneux at 22 Cans, send me an email.
It wouldn't be long before they released their first game, a mobile clicker. Curiosity, or to give it its full title, Curiosity What's Inside the Cube, was released in November of 2012 to something of a mixed reception. Is this actually what Peter Molyneux left Lionhead for? A game where you just tap a screen endlessly like a bloody woodpecker? And you'd be tapping for a long time. The Curiosity Cube apparently consisted of 69 billion cubelets. Fortunately, you'd be working on removing them with everyone else, so long as the servers were up anyway. The removal of the cube's layers took several months, and old Pete had a classic bit of Molyneux ease to deflect accusations that he was just making an artsy cookie clicker.
I'm resisting any temptation in giving any clues what's in the middle. Life-changing is what life-changing, you can look up the dictionary definition of life-changing. You can, if you want, you can score me on how life-changing it is. Give me a score. And I guarantee you, out of 100, that score will be, if not 100, then it'll be 99.
101?
Maybe.
Finally though, on the 26th of May, the final layer of the cube was removed, and all was revealed. The winner, a Scottish student named Brian Henderson, was asked whether he wished to keep the contents of the cube to himself, or if he wanted to share the news to everybody. He chose the latter. So what was Brian Henderson's prize? A highly important role in 22can's new God game that would, apparently, change his life. He would be the God of Gods, with a large amount of control over the game's world, and shares in profits from the finished game.
You, the person who would reach the center, will be the God of all people that are playing Godus. You will intrinsically decide on the rules that the game is played by. And, here's the life-changing bit, you will share in the success of the product. Every time people spend money on Godus, you will get a small piece of that pie.
Curiosity was, in the end, a months-long hype campaign for Molyneux and 22can's new game. Although on reflection it's probably the best thing that the studio's made to date. The God game itself had already been announced. It was called Godus, and had in the main been pushed via the new hip service that everybody was using. Good old Kickstarter. Molyneux's arrival on Kickstarter was the one that people really greeted with suspicion. Why does he need it? This is the man who was, very recently, a big cheese at frickin' Microsoft, a very successful game designer with a lot of personal capital. And he needs to ask people for money?
One of the brilliant things about Kickstarter is that we can use you. It's your help, your input. And if you look at the pledges, we really are going to listen to you. I don't want to promise anything. I just want to deliver the glory of the old days in a new format of today's world. And with your help, we can do that.
He was far from the only one, but these questions didn't come up as much when big industry bods like Tim Schafer, Chris Roberts and Brian Fargo did their Kickstarters. They did for Molyneux and, to a similar extent, David Braben, hitting Kickstarter with Elite Dangerous, having presumably spent most of the last decade failing to make The Outsider. Molyneux, wearing his head of a small studio hat, defended himself against the arguments vigorously, asking why he should be precluded from taking part.
And of course there are some things where people think, Peter is, he's too well established to use Kickstarter. And if I was still part of Microsoft, I'd agree. But being a small independent and investing a lot of your own money in a studio, it's a very scary thing.
This might have been a fair thing to say, but it was risky. Controversies over Molyneux's Kickstarter presence almost derailed the campaign itself, and Godus's funding wasn't a sure thing. In the end though, it made its £450,000 goal with 2 days to spare, earning a total of £526,563. Enough to fund more single-player and cooperative modes, as well as Linux support. Molyneux claimed that Godus would be finished and out in 9 months. Quite surprising, as considering how long it had taken to make most of his games, 9 months was barely any time at all. To be fair, 2013 was largely business as usual. Indie or not, Molyneux was as active in the press as he ever was, and a lot of work was at that time being done on Godus. The initial feeling in the months following on from the Kickstarter wasn't all that terrible. The team was certainly active, and Molyneux, as a general gaming legend, still had a bit of goodwill left. This indie venture seemed to be a lot of fun for him.
These group of Italians then got up every day and said, right, we're going to turn these penises into works of art. And they've created palm trees out of them, they created puppy dog faces out of them, and that was amazing. I mean, what's going on there? They actually did it day after day after day, setting themselves this impossible task. And then it became the penis creators versus the artists. And, you know, when there was this massive, huge thing, what are they going to turn this into? That's amazing.
There's even plenty of footage of Molly doing the odd little thing with YouTube personalities here and there, whether it's talking Godus or having a look back at his old games. It was also not wholly uncommon for Molyneux himself, in the early days of Godus's beta launch, to drop in on regular folks streaming the game on Twitch and have a little chat about it live off the cuff.
So wait, oh my god, it actually is Peter Molyneux. Well, that's made my day. That's made my life. That is amazing. Huge fan, Peter.
These were all very good things indeed, and I would like to stress that, probably because it's the last bit of anything good in this whole video. Alas, something changed on the way. The first worrying sign came in May 2013, when it was announced that the mobile version of Godus would have a publisher, Dina Games. This flew in the face somewhat of Molyneux saying that there would be no publishers involved in the game at any point. People questioned it, but Molly insisted that the game would not be affected, and that the PC version of the game would still come first.
Mode, and it says put the device inside your pocket and lift your leg up to simulate a fart. So let me, hang on, I've not tried this yet.
We've got to try this.
Okay, it's accelerometer here, let's try it.
No. And how embarrassing would that be?
Nope, that brings the score down immediately.
Brilliant idea, poor execution. Yep. That's almost like a testimony to my game design theories.
September 2013 saw the initial release of Godus, on Steam Early Access, and there wasn't a whole lot there. The Odd News report questioned why the game was released in such an incomplete state, and also wondered just what Godus was actually going to be. That still didn't seem to be altogether set in stone yet. However, people did recognise that the game had potential, so long as it lived up to the promises that Molyneux made of a true evolution of the God game, where your civilization could evolve through the ages. People didn't automatically bury Godus. This little clip from Total Biscuit probably sums up the general thoughts on the game.
I think it's got a lot of potential, and I think it could turn out to be a fantastic game. As it stands right now, it's got too many annoyances for me to recommend getting in on the early access. But we are only 40% done with it, so I'm pretty hopeful for it, honestly.
Molyneux was open enough about it all, saying that the game was far from finished, there was a long way to go, and it was all about experimenting. It feels like a test bed, doesn't it? The classic Molyneux practice, only this time with consumers who are paying a tenner to test the game. Not that this is actually uncommon, and indeed one of the effects of Steam Early Access has been to make the testbed something that can be consumed. The game was for a long time at 56% complete. The 2013 version of the game that we just saw was also replaced with a new version that looked nicer but removed quite a few things, including multiplayer and a lot of the combat. The reaction to this new version was quite negative, and people were worried that the whole thing was gradually looking more and more like a mobile game. If there was any proper work done, it seemed to be on that mobile version, which naturally led many people to suspect that Godus was, first and foremost, a mobile game, in spite of Molyneux claiming that it was nothing of the sort. Mobile or not, reviews and impressions of the game in this state were poor. But for a long time people seemed to forget a little about Godus. Until, at the start of 2015, there were rumblings that not all was well at 22 Cans. In February of that year, things came to a head for various reasons. It was known that less and less people at 22 Cans, a small studio to begin with, were working on Godus. Indeed, it seemed that the company were losing staff more than they were gaining them. There had been virtually no news for months and no updates on Steam. That 56% mark never shifted. One fan of the game, Konrad Nazinski, was vocally unhappy about what was happening in Godus and presented his own ideas as to how the game should be going. He ended up getting in contact with Peter, and in classic Molyneux style, Konrad soon found himself employed as the game's new lead designer. But that was as much as people heard. Also, Molyneux himself was talking about Godus less and less, barely mentioning it in interviews, something that was kind of unusual for Molyneux. Instead, he was talking quite a lot about something called The Trail, an upcoming game for which very few details are still yet known. So why is Molyneux not talking about Godus? Is it because... does he think that Godus is actually finished? Maybe he does. Except of course, in the eyes of seemingly everybody with the exception of Peter Molyneux, it clearly wasn't. And this was the big one. The gaming press decided to find out what happened to Brian Henderson, the reported god of gods who'd opened up the cube and whose life was apparently going to be changed. And they were dismayed by what they found. Henderson's life was decidedly unchanged. He hadn't heard a fin from 22 Cans for months. His God of Gods award and shares in the game's profit, they seemed to be distant and remote. Indeed, very few people had received anything from their Kickstarter pledges. There were supposed to be art books and the like, but nothing was there. And this was the angle from which 22 Cans, and Molyneux in particular, would take an absolute battering in the press. They say that in Guildford you may well have heard the sound of 100 spinning plates smashing on the ground as all of these negative stories suddenly came out. Molyneux and the group mobilised desperately, providing updates on what had been happening in an attempt to prove that they had been working on Godus all this time, which, honestly, not a lot of people believed.
There is a catalogue of things that I did badly and incorrectly because I'd never done a Kickstarter campaign before, I had never released on Steam Early Access before, I'd never done a mobile game before, and all of these things meant I made some horrendous mistakes.
The opinion was that Molyneux had done it again. He'd made promises that once again he had not been able to keep. Only this time he'd done it with the help of his fans' money. Molyneux had often been referred to as a pipe dreamer, and perhaps even in some circles as a liar. That's something he's even sheepishly at times admitted to. This, however, was the first time that other epithets such as snake oil salesman, scam artist, and con man could actually stick to him. After Brian Henderson, it has to be said that they were more than a little deserved.
I don't want to ever make those mistakes before. We are still passionate about Godus. We've got a team on Godus. We've already spoken about, what they'll be doing on there. I apologise to everyone for the mistakes that I've made, and you have been harsh, and please continue to be harsh.
And so we come to that question. The first question John Walker asked, and the brutal interview that followed. Even more than when we get to Godus as it actually is now, this is probably the crucial moment of this whole part. I'm not about to say it's a good bit of journalism because it's not really, and nor is it meant to be. It's savage and emotional, something that's not just born out of recent Godus news, but through years of bad feeling. These were the questions that someone obviously wanted to ask Molyneux for years, but couldn't. It's angry, basically. Molyneux is on the defensive throughout, trying to persuade John Walker to just come to the studio and you'll see all that's going on. But Walker, with all the fury of a man who considers himself to be gaming journalism's Jeremy Paxman, plus the added fury of thousands of pissed off backers, is steadfast in his questioning. Of the Linux port that's clearly not going to happen, of all the failed promises, of the lack of progress, and of what's going to happen about Brian Henderson. It's harsh and emotional, yes, but a lot of it, in fact pretty much all of it, is deserved. After years of kid gloves, it could almost be said that Peter Molyneux had it coming. The upshot of it all was in the article's headline: Molyneux is not going to give interviews to the press anymore. With this, an interview in Eurogamer, and a final interview in The Guardian, he did his I'm shutting up tour. Everything Peter Molyneux knew was won, and suddenly Peter Molyneux found himself not able to be Peter Molyneux anymore. Even if he let quite a few people know that he couldn't be Peter Molyneux anymore, if you catch my drift. He also hired a man named Simon Phillips to be CEO of 22 Cans and handle the business side of things, ostensibly leaving Molly to get on with designing games. Phillips, a 20-year industry veteran, came in basically on a mission of mercy. Morale at this point was understandably quite low, and he made lots of noise in the press about putting things right and putting an utterly broken Peter Molyneux back together again. Now don't get it twisted, I'm not about to defend Molyneux, because a lot of things went wrong here. More than anything else in his career, this was where Molyneux deserved a serious grilling because he absolutely screwed up. His treatment of Brian Henderson was appalling, as was his treatment of every other person who'd backed the game. His promise that the game would be out in 9 months was pure comedy, and his later claim that he actually wasn't massively late because his current record for creating a game stood at 3 years? Yeah, that's obviously bullshit. If things were different and Molyneux was still under a major publisher, Godus would have probably been cancelled a long time ago, and I reckon that if no questions had ever been asked, well, we wouldn't have heard anything. Molyneux struggled to adapt to truly independent life, to what crowdfunding meant to a lot of people. It's not like you can just not deliver at all anymore and face the consequences, because there's so much worse for your reputation. Contingency is not something that people care about as a stretch goal either. The game had changed, but Molyneux didn't quite understand the rules. Do I think that he set out with the intention of fleecing people on the game? No, I think that's a pretty silly thing to say. But do I think that he royally screwed up far more than at any other point in his career? Yes, absolutely. And when things fell apart, there was no protection. In the face of a John Walker type demanding accountability, all the old press tricks weren't going to work. Where are all these PR people? Where are they when you're independent? They don't exist. Maybe they never existed. Looking back on it all, you can see a few reasons why the story just ran and ran. The story of Brian Henderson is an obvious human interest factor. Kickstarters widening on waves of hype from old masters apparently now free to do what they did best were frustrating people as they then struggled or just took forever. Molyneux was both an easy and a very deserving scapegoat for that frustration, and I think people were tired of the kid gloves in general. They were frustrated with Molyneux just automatically thinking everything would be the same as it was in 1989 or 1997, and now pulling his tricks with actual people's money. Molyneux's reputation had taken hits in the past thanks to all those undelivered promises and what have you, but this was when his reputation shattered. All the acorns rolled up into a ball and nothing compared. There's more to come when we get to his legacy. But for now we do have to look a little at Godus as it is currently. It's now called Godus Wars, coming to Steam in that form early this year as a free update for those who already owned Godus, and 11 quid for everyone else. The cynical minded say that renaming the game like this was probably to hide the hundreds of pages worth of negative reviews that were on Steam's original Godus page. As it is, Godus Wars is still in early access, it's apparently still being worked on, and Brian Henderson doesn't really care anymore. And so, as the final game in a video that's covered so many Peter Molyneux games, what's it actually like? Well, let's look at the original half first. This is Godus in its 2.4 version. There's apparently some sort of story, and some other folks running about called the Astarwai. The game appears to be some sort of simplified hybrid between Populous and Black and White, only without either the ultimate goal of the former or the complex AI of the latter. And I say appears to be because honestly, there's not much game here at all. You drag the mouse about and do lots of terraforming, make sure that your followers have the required amount of flat land to build their abodes, collect belief as and when, maybe send the odd follower to a pit so you can get gems, and that's about it. Well, I mean, I would say that it appears to be an okay proof of concept, but that is basically all I could say about the game, and that's if I felt like being in any way positive about the game, which I don't, and that'll become clear. Oh, anyway, actually I've missed out stuff. While you're terraforming, you can get chests, which will give you stickers which you can put on your cards and get you closer to activating them. The cards can do things like, I don't know, give you more belief for destroying a wok. Sometimes there's bits of story hidden in them, which is the odd paragraph of nonsense here and there. Occasionally the Astarwai mill about the edge of your territory, meaning you literally have to get them off your lawn by sculpting the land around them. What else? Oh, you can use a leash to drag your followers to where you want them to go. And there's a voyage bit with really exciting terraforming minigames like build a bridge over the sea. This uninspiring mix of gradually more complex puzzles and really annoying AI is truthfully the most game that there is in this package. And, yep, I think that's it. There is literally nothing else to be done in this game, and no purpose aside from just gaining more followers. Oh, and Peter Molyneux drones on about how there'll all be big skyscrapers here one day in the dev commentary. I'm not seeing it, honestly.
We really, in design terms, I really want you to, the reason why we slightly paused the game here, I really want you to get used to leashing. I want you to get used to this way of gameplay. If something is taking a long time, focus on something else. If building is taking a long time, focus on picking up rocks now that they're worth 10 times their belief when you unlock this card.
To be honest, there is more, but getting to it is just beyond tedious. The terraforming or sculpting doesn't work, really. It's not fun to do, not even as fun as clicking around in Populous. There's no depth to it. It's more like a sparsely populated God sandbox where you spend a load of time just unlocking things that you can just screw around with. It all feels like what it is, a poor conversion of a mobile game that clearly took precedence and something that as a game feels utterly incomplete. Like I said, maybe it could be an okay proof of concept, even if it seems as though it's a hodgepodge of classic Molly games only with all that's good about said games taken out, COD touchscreen controls, and a level of depth that makes Farmville look like a frickin' Paradox game. There could be something there, but alas, this may be what Godus looks like now, but it's also what Godus looked like, almost 2 years ago. And since then we have seen nothing at all on PC. There's apparently a bit more on mobile, if you give a toss. This, the serene side of Godus, is in all likelihood how it is always going to look, and there is pretty much nothing there. This half of Godus is, well, it's basically dead. It's not worth another word. All that you see is dead. Look, I could basically recreate the parrot sketch here, but I think you got the message okay. It's dead. Let's move on. Godus Wars is the other side, and is Godus's biggest update so far, so big that it necessitated its own Steam page. Apparently 11 people worked on it, including the aforementioned Conrad, who was pissed off at how Godus was going and ended up hired for it. Geez, no wonder he was pissed. Anyway, Brian Henderson is also apparently here as one of the opposing deities. Essentially, this is supposed to take all that's in Godus and fashion it into a God-come real-time strategy game. Also, the game featured a microtransaction on release where you'd have to buy the second continent if you wanted to continue playing the game, because someone obviously thought that Godus hadn't pissed people off enough. After a staggeringly negative reaction, this was pulled after a day. Now of course this is still an early access game, and I guess that should be kept in mind. All the terraforming and whatnot is still here, but now once enough abodes have been built you can fashion them into a citadel, and from that citadel you can make warbands. Warbands smash up the enemy's troops, and the ultimate goal is to capture the enemy's belief vault. Simple enough really. Indeed, very simple. This is bog standard RTS play if that, with a little bit of God stuff thrown in. But again, it is early access, isn't it? I should keep that in mind. There's a little splurge at the start from Molly himself, saying that he always envisioned Godus as 2 separate games, the peaceful side that we've already seen, and this, which I find very hard to believe as this has clearly been knocked together very quickly indeed. Again, it's an average proof of concept at best. It's almost like there could potentially be some sort of RTS here, but it's nowhere near close to ready. Nor is it in any way fun to play, nor does it inspire any sort of enthusiasm. It shouldn't surprise anybody to hear that impressions of Godus Wars were terrible, but I think that would be the case even if it hadn't have been for all the shit surrounding Godus, even though that obviously had a lot to do with it. Rumours had it that even the statement that 11 people were actively working on Godus Wars was an exaggeration, and that in terms of actual game design, there may have only been one. Conrad. It's easy to picture him sitting in a corner, chaining through the day's 3rd bottle of vape juice, trying to get something, anything workable out of Godus. I have a lot of sympathy for the guy, in all honesty. Still, this all feels a bit immaterial. Why? Because there hasn't been any update on Godus Wars since March. 4 months and not a pipsqueak has been heard. The 22 Cans website doesn't help much either. The last update on there is from the summer of 2015. Godus Wars isn't even mentioned on it. To put things in perspective, here's another formerly early access game, Prison Architect by Introversion, a team relatively comparable in size to 22 Cans, if not smaller. The alpha for this was made available in September 2012, and again, there wasn't a whole lot there. But the team updated constantly, always making new builds available. It was always clear that something was going on, from the first alpha to the game's eventual final release in October 2015. That's what should be expected. Needless to say, Godus as a whole falls massively short of these standards. So is Godus Wars dead too? Well, there's a bit of news that brings this whole video right up to date. It's about Conrad and it came out a couple of days ago. Has he had some new ideas for the game? Is he about to take people through another new build? I mean, Godus may be virtually damned already, but is he still fighting the good fight? No, he's been let go. Conrad no longer works for 22 Cans. His contract ran out and was not renewed. According to most people, Konrad Nazinski was indeed the last person who was working on Godus in any way, shape or form. Simon Phillips, the company CEO, has gone on record to say that of course Godus is not dead. Obviously it's just resting, pining for the fields. No, there's no release date or even a rough idea of one. Let's face it, it's pretty clear that everyone at 22 Cans is now working on this game called The Trail. But what even is The Trail? It's a Molyneux game, apparently. He's used all sorts of words like communication and discovery to describe it, but not much else. And it's a mobile game. Also, when Molyneux announced the game in 2014, it came as a bit of a surprise to folks at 22 Cans who didn't know a whole lot about it either. Nothing ever changes, does it? Seriously, to be honest, it barely matters what The Trail is. Godus will forever leave a bad taste in the mouth at the merest mention of Peter Molyneux's name. It has sullied his reputation forever. It is, to say the least, an absolute shit show. Again, just to show how steep the decline is. In almost 4 years, this is where Godus is at. In the late 90s, it took a then 30-strong Lionhead studio 4 years to make black and frickin' white. How the mighty have fallen. This is it now. He may not be a CEO, but Peter Molyneux can never go home again. Even if he appears in the press, and of course he has a number of times since that farewell tour, someone will be there to say that they thought that Molly wasn't ever going to speak to the press again. And quite right too. But Molyneux needs to be in the press. Who else can sell his games except him? No one else has ever tried. Selling games is kind of what he frickin' does. Without Molyneux in public, the games will fail. And so, well, The Trail? It's already dead. It would have to be quite literally the greatest game ever made for it to repair the damage done to 22 Cans and to the reputation of Peter Molyneux. This whole sorry episode is one of the most tragic ends to a glittering career, or at least it should be, that I have covered, and it's painful, but not one bit of it was undeserved. Summing up Godus isn't easy. It feels like a shame to cap off this look at Peter Molyneux with the absolute worst thing he's ever produced, but that's the way the cookie crumbles. I mean, it's a completely average mobile game at best, so even without everything else it would still be a bad ending. But of course Molly had to go ahead and promise that the game would redefine the God genre. He can't ever just deliver. The damage it did to his reputation has already been discussed, but there's the damage it did to other things like, say, Kickstarter. This whole thing could be a cautionary tale, something to stop people from donating to any Kickstarter at all. It's a sad fact. For all the good projects that come out of Kickstarter, one Godus can wipe away the achievements of 20 Shovel Knights, Undertales and, hell, even Elite Dangerouses. David Braben, who came onto Kickstarter at the same time as Molly and was also greeted with a fair bit of suspicion, he managed to do a pretty good job with his game. But people are always going to remember the failures that came from Kickstarter rather than the successes, and few have failed harder than Godus did. Worst of all though is the damage to the studio itself. 22 Cans was a good team, a healthy mix of youngsters and vets, including several who have been loyal to Molyneux since the beginning, and they've all been screwed by this whole thing. That to me is one of the most important parts of Molyneux's legacy, the talent that has come from under his wing, and here that's just a washout. It's a black mark on a CV. Oh, and speaking of Peter Molyneux's legacy, well, perhaps it's time to finally wrap this whole thing up. What exactly is the legacy of Peter Molyneux? It's tough to say or even to break it down into what's good and bad, especially after all that bad. But we have to look at everything as a whole. There is that passion and bullshit question, because there are a lot of contradictions when it comes to even the most commonly received opinions. For example, if Molyneux was a serial bullshitter purely interested in money, why did he ever leave both EA and Microsoft? Molly was able to climb close to the top of the greasy pole not once, but twice, and both times he ditched it all right at the point where he could have just buggered off and counted his cash for the rest of time. And then there's the interviews. I mean, Peter Molyneux in interviews is pure chaos in motion. When it comes to selling a game, an experience, there is arguably no one better in the history of the industry. He is a master salesman. He was a trendsetter here. During a time when most games people could barely look a camera in the eye, Molyneux stood out as a man in his element. If making games is where Molly feels most alive, being in front of the camera is a close second. Being a salesman though comes with faults, especially when you end up breaking all the rules. Arguably there are few people who are actually worse at PR than he is. He promises too much, he talks excitedly about concepts years before they're ready, he screws up, admits he's made mistakes, and then makes those same mistakes again. He'll admit behind the scenes that hey, you gotta sell these things, or that he's made stuff up on the spot, but it won't stop him. He gets carried away because he genuinely does love what he makes and thinks that it's capable of so much. I mean, remember that a Molyneux game does tend to evolve after all. Something like the Acorn, for example, that came very early in the original Fable's development, when it was still Project Ego. There's no record of an acorn turning into a tree that I can find in any of the full-on junkets Molly did for Fable in 2002 or 2003. It was an early fancy, and the idea was probably dropped early on. But it is just one example of many. It is easy to get carried away with him because of how much he gets carried away. The Acorn is special though, as it is one of the few times that Molyneux gets caught on a sticky wicket. Sometimes he is careful. Those bigger lies, such as having multiplayer in the original, or children, easy to dial back. They're big, they couldn't be done in time, they'll be in the sequel, and so they were. An evolving Acorn's never big enough to be a major focus, it requires a lot of resources and so forth, and so it just gets dropped again and again. The development of a Peter Molyneux game is not conducive to such little details being planned out in advance, as opposed to them just happening as panicked flourishes. But then Molyneux always goes on and on about those little details anyway, instead of actually talking about a freaking game. Which is why, well, he should really just stop hitting himself. Of course, there are bigger lies out there. Which brings me to the question of what exactly went wrong. How did Peter Molyneux fall so hard? So many of his games deal with the concept of evolution, but it seems to me that one person never truly evolved. And that was him. Certainly in a business sense. In the 90s, everything he touched turned to gold. Bullfrog were one of the best companies around. And with that, Molyneux's business practices and games development practices were set in stone, never to change. With Lionhead, things didn't change all that much, even though the manpower and resources required for a successful game studio increased dramatically, and he just about got away with it. But those original plans to retain a small team and create a single game at a time were unworkable, and they fell apart spectacularly. The company almost paid the ultimate price back then until Microsoft stepped in. And then, with 22 Cans, Molyneux was still trying to do the same thing, only with regular people supplying the resources. It was completely unworkable. To create games in that usual, disorganised way, it was doomed from the start. Something was bound to go wrong. And so it did. And it was the worst possible thing to go wrong. The plans for the Kickstarter backers and Brian Henderson. Peter Molyneux seems to think that just because a business plan, a credo worked so well before that it's bound to work again. But the world of gaming has changed so much at all levels. Perhaps, I don't know, he saw something in the independent world that would allow him to channel that Bullfrog spirit, but even there the world has changed and suddenly Peter Molyneux is completely out of touch with it. There's a level of openness and planning required that Molyneux would never be able to truly give, and thanks to things like Kickstarter that allow indie developers the chance to find resources they'd have never had before, the standards are always rising and the rewards are highly lucrative. It's a cutthroat world where everyone is always demanding attention, where big games come out of nowhere at a lightning pace. It was a world that Peter Molyneux, with his evolving games, golden promises and lengthy development cycles, was completely unfit to enter. Maybe he thought that with his clout and experience the indie gaming world would surely be an easy win. If so, he was won. He came in there like a bull in a frickin' china shop and all he did was smash a load of vases and kick a few chickens. It goes without saying that all of these things have greatly damaged Molyneux's legacy, as they should. There is a lot of good that he's done. It could be argued that Molyneux is at the centre of a couple of generations worth of excellent British game developers. His effect on the British games industry is massive, and on the whole very positive. We wouldn't be anywhere near where we are in the world of gaming without Bullfrog, Lionhead and Molyneux. Even now, there are many successful companies that are set up with Molyneux alumni, or that have taken their own lessons from Molyneux, good or bad. And he has made some very good games indeed, although admittedly not for a while. He is always going to be frustrated though because he will never get to be where he wants to be. He can't just go back to designing games at the head of a company. If Peter Molyneux is to have any further impact on the world of gaming that's positive, he will have to pick one of those two paths. At the moment he's designing. But can he actually stay there? I don't know. Honestly, I doubt it. In the end though, after everything, do I like Peter Molyneux? There is something about him that still makes me like him, or really want to like him, even after all the shit there's been. Perhaps it's that earnestness, the ability that he has to make something seem like a truly otherworldly experience. Or maybe he still has goodwill from the positive stuff he's done, giving young folk their start in the industry, or just making those great games. Maybe there's a blind faith there that somehow, in spite of all the evidence to the contrary, he actually can get back to what he once was. There is a force for good in Peter Molyneux, and it wants to get out. I honestly believe that. Although for it to do so would require drastic changes that frankly I don't think he would be prepared to do. And at the core of all of this, in spite of all that utter bullshit and incompetence, there is a rather personable man who would probably be very nice to have a drink with. He'd certainly have a lot of stories to tell, that's for sure. You would just have to prepare yourself for the moment when, after a cracking meal and way too much wine, he pulls out the briefcase and tries to sell you a plot of land.
This is my life, my passion. I don't think I'll ever stop. I don't think I would know what to do with my life without making games. It's a fantastic, amazing, incredible job. I get to have a dream and see that as reality. What else could you do?
Thanks so much for watching the last part of the Peter Molyneux saga, and indeed for watching the whole series if you have. It certainly has been a rollercoaster of a journey. If you like this video then please consider subscribing, and also consider following me on my social media and supporting me on Patreon. Okay, let's get down to the usual Sinson antics. Martin Pataki, Taylor Hammond, Mark Johnston, Twisted Squad, Joel Hartman, Phil Taprog, Ben Coker, Jamie Hampshire, Andre Russell, Leah Norris, and Grayson Blackpaw. Yeah, that sounded alright. And of course we have more thank yous to deliver. We have Tim Lintz, Robert Kelly, Alexander Baldeck, Dan Wasco, Terry Anderson, Francisco Pimenta, Kev Gilmore, Alexander Green, Thomas Daniels, Greg Olson, Christian Earnshaw, Stuart Ashen, Lee Harris, Tiago Pereira dos Santos Silva, James Idd, Mike Siegler, Ed Reader, Russell Hugo, Ken Barraclough, Mark Johnson, Gerard Morris, Matt Lee, Paolo Leary, Graham Kamak, Scott Mitten, Nicole Ketchum, Mark Brooks, Ninth Demon, Peter Sidorn, Ludwig Holmstrom, John Ezel, Kit Leary, Elle O'Brien, Dave Parkinson, Novel, and Olaf Allbean. Thank you all so much for amazing support. What a series it has been. Truly one of the hardest things that I think I've ever done on this channel, but we made it. We made it through Peter Molyneux, and now, well, we can all move on to something else. That something else should be coming pretty soon, where we will be going to the land of Japan for a video either on a really weird Kusogi sort of game, or a certain sound team. I'm not quite sure yet, I'll probably end up doing both though. But until then, it is time to say goodbye. Thank you all so much for watching, and wherever you are, whoever you be, have a good one, take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.